If you've been watching Rick and Morty for any length of time, you know that the show is comfortable operating in chaos. Episodes come and go, adventures start, they spiral out, and by the end of most of them, the status quo is restored, or something close to it. Characters get hurt, dimensions get destroyed, and then next week, everybody's eating dinner again like nothing happened. That's part of the show's charm. It doesn't owe you continuity, it doesn't have to be serious, it can be whatever it wants to be. But then there are moments when the show slows down and looks you directly in the eye. Moments when it drops the bit and says, no, this actually matters. Pay attention. Evil Morty is one of those moments, except it's not just a moment, it's a thread that runs through the entire series, showing up quietly, pulling on things, rearranging things, until finally, in Season 5, it comes forward and rearranges the entire cosmology of the show. And it does it in a way that feels earned, because the show planted everything it needed years earlier. So let's slow down and go through all of it. Not rushing, not skipping, just following the story from the beginning, from the earliest context that explains why any of this matters, all the way through to the moment a Morty walks through a portal into an infinite universe and doesn't look back. To understand why Evil Morty matters so much, you first have to understand what a Morty is supposed to be in the world of the show, and what Mortys are supposed to be within the larger structure of the multiverse. Because Evil Morty's entire story is a reaction to that structure. The architecture of his anger is built on the foundation of what the show establishes about Morty as a role, as a function, as a category of being. In the world of Rick and Morty, there are infinite dimensions, an infinite number of parallel universes, each with its own version of events, its own version of physics, its own version of history. Some of those dimensions look a lot like ours, some are radically different, and in what appears to be a very large number of them, perhaps most of the ones that the series treats as accessible, there's a configuration that repeats. A Rick and a Morty, an old genius and a young anxious boy, grandfather and grandson. The show gestures at this early and often. One of the foundational ideas of the series is that Rick and Morty are not unique. Rick C137 and his Morty are not special. They're one instance of a configuration that exists across countless dimensions. When you meet Rick C137, you're meeting one of an enormous number of effectively identical Ricks, each living out some version of the same essential story. And when you meet Morty, you're meeting one of an enormous number of Mortys, shaped by similar circumstances, carrying similar anxieties, living next to a similar genius. This is usually played for dark comedy, but the existence of infinite Ricks and infinite Mortys has a structural implication that the show eventually follows all the way through. It means there's an institution that has grown around that redundancy, an institution that has decided to make use of it. That institution is the Citadel of Ricks, and the way it uses Mortys is the foundation of everything Evil Morty eventually becomes. Let's slow down on what a Morty actually is within the show's internal logic, because it's important and it's something the series reveals gradually but never takes back. Ricks are geniuses, the smartest beings in the universe, or at least in the portion of the universe the show eventually names the Central Finite Curve. That genius is identifiable. It produces a specific, distinctive brainwave pattern, a signature that in the show's logic can be tracked and detected by anyone with the right technology. When a Rick is traveling through the multiverse, that brainwave signature is like a beacon, trackable, visible to anyone looking for it. The problem, if you're a Rick who wants to move through the multiverse without being tracked, is obvious. You're identifiable. Every step you take leaves a trace. Every dimension you enter, you announce yourself with your own intelligence. The solution, as the show eventually lays out, is proximity to a Morty. The anxiety patterns produced by a Morty's brain, the specific frequency of their nervous adolescent energy, their uncertainty, their emotional noise, create a kind of static around the genius signal. A Rick traveling with a Morty is a Rick who's harder to track. The Morty's brainwaves don't cancel the Rick's signature exactly. They interfere with it in a way that makes precise detection difficult. The metaphor the show offers is that the genius in the signal gets lost in the noise. This is the single most foundational piece of lore in the entire Evil Morty arc, and it's essential to understand before anything else, because it establishes something brutal about the relationship between every Rick and every Morty. The relationship has a functional, technical purpose that has nothing to do with love, nothing to do with family, and nothing to do with the genuine affection that sometimes exists between Rick C137 and his Morty. The relationship has a purpose. Mortys are useful, and the show builds its entire institutional structure on that usefulness. The Citadel of Ricks understood this. They formalized it, systematized it, built an entire society around the signal-noise dynamic between Ricks and Mortys. Every Rick affiliated with the Citadel gets a Morty. The Morty travels with the Rick. The Rick's signature is dampened. The system works. But what does this mean for the Mortys? That's the question the show takes its time answering, and it's the question that Evil Morty's entire arc is built around. If Mortys exist within this system as functional dampening tools, as brainwave camouflage, then their well-being is secondary to their utility. Their experiences, their pain, their desires, their development as people, all of that is subordinate to the role they serve. You take care of the Morty well enough to keep the dampening working. You don't necessarily take care of the Morty because the Morty is a person who deserves care. The show doesn't say this explicitly in the early seasons. It implies it. It builds the implication into the texture of the world, the way the Citadel operates, the way Mortys are assigned and transferred and discussed as assets, the way the system treats them as a category of being rather than as individuals. And by the time the show is ready to say it explicitly, in the Ricklantis Mixup, the foundation has been laid patiently enough that it lands as revelation rather than introduction. Evil Morty is the consequence of this system. Not the only consequence. There are Mortys throughout the series who show signs of being damaged by their circumstances, by the adventures, by the way they're used and exposed to things they weren't built to handle. But Evil Morty is the consequence who noticed the system, understood the system at a structural level, and decided to do something about it. That is the core of who he is. Not a villain who wants to destroy things because destruction is satisfying. A product of an institution who decided the institution needed to be dismantled. What makes Evil Morty so memorable? What makes him the character most people point to when they talk about Rick and Morty's best long-term storytelling is the economy of his characterization. The show gives him very little screen time across the entire run. He appears briefly in Season 1. He reappears in Season 3. His plan reaches its conclusion in Season 5. That's it. 3 seasons, several years, and a total amount of dialogue that you could probably transcribe in a few pages. And yet he's one of the most vivid characters in the series because every minute he's on screen is doing multiple things at once. The show never wastes time with Evil Morty. Every appearance adds new information, shifts the meaning of what came before, and leaves the audience with questions that the next appearance will partially answer. This economy is unusual for long-form television storytelling. Most shows that run multi-season antagonist arcs give their antagonists extensive screen time. You understand who they are through exposure, through watching them make decisions across many episodes, through dialogue that elaborates the perspective over time. Evil Morty works differently. He's characterized almost entirely through what he does rather than what he says, and what he does, the show reveals slowly, was planned long in advance. The patience of his characterization mirrors the patience of his plan. He doesn't explain himself until he's finished. He doesn't ask for understanding. He doesn't seek validation. He just moves toward his objective quietly over years of in-universe time and only speaks clearly when there's nothing left to take away from him. Before we get into the specific episodes, it's worth dwelling on the structural significance of what Evil Morty represents within the show's mythology. Rick and Morty is, at its core, a show about the relationship between a genius and a boy. That relationship contains multitudes. It's sometimes loving, sometimes exploitative, sometimes genuinely tender, sometimes deeply manipulative. Rick C137 is not a good person by conventional standards, but his relationship with Morty is one of the things that complicates his badness in interesting ways. He cares about Morty, even if he doesn't always act like it, even if the caring is tangled up with selfishness and control. The show has spent 5 seasons now exploring the interiority of that relationship and the way it shapes both characters. Evil Morty is what happens when you remove the complexity from that dynamic and look at the structure underneath. Strip away the genuine feeling. Strip away the specific history between Rick C137 and his Morty. Strip away the comedy and the sentiment and the moments of real connection. What you're left with is the mechanical description. A genius and a boy traveling together. The boy serving as camouflage for the genius. The genius deciding what they do and where they go and what gets sacrificed along the way. Evil Morty looked at that mechanical description. He saw it clearly, maybe more clearly than any other Morty in the multiverse. And his response was not to find a better Rick, not to seek out a version of the relationship that would treat him as more than camouflage. His response was to acquire the capability to dismantle the entire framework that made that relationship possible. That's not a small thing. That's not the anger of one person at one bad relationship. That's a structural critique carried to its logical conclusion at enormous enormous personal cost and over an enormous period of time. Whatever else Evil Morty is, he is not small. There's one more thing worth establishing before we get into the chronology of his appearances, the question of which Rick he was originally paired with and what happened in that pairing. The show is deliberately vague about this. We know that Evil Morty existed within the Citadel system at some point. He had enough proximity to the institution to understand it from the inside, enough access to Rick-level technology to weaponize it, and enough specific knowledge of Rick C-137 to frame him with convincing precision. That suggests a history inside the Citadel structure, or at least on its margins. We do not know who his original Rick was. We do not know whether that Rick was abusive in the most obvious sense, or whether the experience was something more subtle, the accumulated weight of being treated as a tool rather than a person over years in a way that left no single dramatic injury to point to, but carved out something essential nonetheless. The show doesn't give us the origin story, it gives us the result. This choice is deliberate and important. By not showing us the source of Evil Morty's formation, the show keeps his story from being reduced to a personal narrative of one Morty wronged by one Rick. His anger is structural, not personal. He's not running a vendetta against one abuser. He's responding to a system. The specific Morty who became him, the specific Rick he was paired with, the specific experiences that shaped him, those are unknown, and leaving them unknown keeps the focus where the show wants it, on what the system does, not on what one bad actor within the system did. If you gave Evil Morty a detailed, dramatic origin with a specific villain Rick who wronged him, you'd localize his story. You'd turn it into a revenge narrative. The show instead keeps his story general in a way that makes it about every Morty, or at least about what every Morty in the system is exposed to, whether or not any specific Morty was exposed to the worst version of it. Evil Morty, across his appearances, does several remarkable things. He builds a surveillance and intelligence operation capable of gathering Rick C-137's memories without C-137's knowledge. He engineers an assassination campaign complex enough to temporarily frame the most notorious free agent Rick in the multiverse. He navigates Citadel politics well enough to win an election in an institution populated almost entirely by geniuses who would ordinarily laugh at the idea of a Morty holding institutional power. He systematically dismantles the Council of Ricks, and he destroys the Central Finite Curve, a structure that, as the show reveals, was designed by the most intelligent beings in the accessible multiverse and maintained for their collective benefit. He does all of this with almost no dialogue, almost no screen time, no dramatic monologues about his pain, no extended sequences where the show asks you to feel sympathy for him. He just moves, and the things he does speak for themselves. The show does not frame him as a hero. It doesn't frame him as a villain either exactly. It frames him as a consequence, something that the system produced when it was working exactly as designed, as opposed to failing. The Citadel didn't create Evil Morty because it malfunctioned. It created him because it functioned, because the thing it was built to do, which was extract utility from Mortys in service of Ricks, worked as intended on enough Mortys for long enough that eventually one of those Mortys understood the mechanism and decided to break it. That is the most interesting kind of antagonist, not the exception to a system, but its logical conclusion. The show's restraint in how it uses Evil Morty extends to the question of his interiority. We almost never know what he's feeling. We almost never know the full extent of what he's thinking. He's opaque in a way that's sometimes frustrating and ultimately correct, because part of his characterization is precisely that opacity. He doesn't need your understanding. He doesn't perform his motivation. He has a goal, and he's pursuing it, and your comprehension of his emotional state is not something he's optimizing for. The one glimpse we do get of Evil Morty's interior life, and it's brief, controlled, and measured, is his speech in the Season 5 finale, a short, calm articulation of what the Central Finite Curve is and why he's destroying it. No self-pity, no blame, no detailed inventory of the ways he was wronged. Just an explanation of the structure he found himself in and the choice he made about it. He says that the curve is a boundary around the portion of the multiverse where Rick is always the smartest. He says he's going outside it. He implies, without fully stating, that his reason for leaving is that inside the curve, being a Morty means something specific and permanent, a role, a function, a status. And outside the curve, maybe it doesn't have to. That's the whole speech. He doesn't doesn't linger, he doesn't ask for understanding, he doesn't wait for a reaction. He says what he needs to say, and he goes through the portal. If you've been watching since season 1, if you've followed this character through every appearance, noticed every detail, sat with every question the show raised and didn't answer, that speech lands like something that was always coming. The quietest possible conclusion to the loudest possible story. One thing worth noting, before we move into the episode chronology, is the question of what Evil Morty's actions cost. Not in the abstract sense, but literally.
The Ricklantis Mixup is the episode where we see Evil Morty's presidential victory, and one of the things the episode is careful to show you is that his path to the presidency involved having Ricks killed. Not just the victims of his Season 1 operation, actual Citadel citizens, eliminated as threats or obstacles in his campaign's final hours. The show does not let you forget this. It holds the image of floating bodies alongside the victory speech simultaneously. Evil Morty is correct that the Citadel is exploitative. He is correct that the system treats Mortys as less than people. He is correct that the Central Finite Curve is a structure designed to guarantee that certain beings remain subordinate. His critique of the institution is not wrong. And he is also someone who killed people, controlled people, used people as tools in ways that mirror the very system he's critiquing. The show holds both of these things at once. It doesn't resolve the tension.
It doesn't ask you to decide whether he's right or wrong. It presents him as a character who had correct grievances and pursued those grievances through methods that were monstrous. Those two things can coexist. They do coexist. And the discomfort of that coexistence is part of what makes Evil Morty such an enduring figure. He is not a monster who happens to have valid points. He is not a hero who happens to use bad methods. He is something more uncomfortable than either, a product of a genuinely unjust system who became as capable of using people as the system that formed him. So that's who Evil Morty is, at the level of character and theme. The rest of this script is about how the show built that character, slowly, patiently, across seasons, through the specific events and specific episodes that constitute his arc. We'll start where the show started. Season 1, Episode 10, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. The first episode that showed us the Citadel of Ricks, the first episode that gave us an Evil Morty, and the first glimpse of a character who would spend the next 4 seasons planning his exit from the world the show invented. Turn the lights down a little. Get comfortable. We've got a lot of ground to cover. There's also something worth dwelling on about the timing of Evil Morty's appearances relative to the show's overall structure. He appears in Season 1 before the show has established the full scope of its mythology. At that point, the viewer doesn't have enough context to understand what they're seeing. You know he's unusual, a Morty who's been running an operation rather than reacting to one, but you don't have the full picture of the Citadel, the brainwave dampening logic, the Central Finite Curve, any of the larger institutional architecture that would make his story legible as something more than an interesting episode twist. The show places him there anyway, trusting that the viewer will either carry the question forward or revisit it later. And when you rewatch that Season 1 episode, knowing everything the show eventually reveals, it's striking how fully realized he already is in those 30 seconds. The eye patch removal, the calm assessment of whether his exposure changes his position, the decision to exit rather than fight or explain. He's complete in that moment. He was always complete. The show just hadn't shown you enough of the world yet for his completeness to be fully visible. That compression of characterization, the way the show front-loaded his essential nature in a moment brief enough that you could miss it on first viewing, is one of the more impressive sleights of hand in the series. By the time you understand what you saw, you've already formed an impression. The impression turns out to be accurate. The show didn't need to revise who he was in light of where his story went. He was always going to be the character who walks through the portal at the end of Season 5. You could see it if you knew where to look in that quiet moment in Season 1 when he removed the eye patch and decided to go. The other thing the show does in establishing Evil Morty's significance is what it chooses not to show. It doesn't show his daily life. It doesn't show the long stretches of time between his appearances when he's presumably doing the intelligence and operational work that makes each appearance possible. It doesn't show his doubts, if he has any. It doesn't show his relationships with other Mortys or the internal life that presumably exists behind the opacity he presents. This is a conscious stylistic choice. Evil Morty is characterized through gaps as much as through content. The show shows you the endpoints, the operation, the election, the escape, and leaves the connective tissue invisible. What you're left with is the impression of a character who exists outside your field of vision most of the time, working towards something, and who only becomes visible at the moments when his work produces an outcome. This mirrors something real about certain kinds of intelligence and patience. The people, or beings, who make the most significant changes to complex systems are often the least visible while they're doing the work. They're not announcing their intentions or building an audience for their efforts. They're doing the unglamorous preparatory work that makes the decisive moment possible. Evil Morty is characterized as that kind of actor. You see his decisive moments. The rest is inference. What the inference produces, if you're willing to sit with it, is a picture of an entity who spent an enormous amount of time, years in the timeline the show implies, building toward outcomes that the episodes only show us in their final form. The election in the Ricklantis Mixup is not spontaneous. The intelligence operation that gathered Rick C-137's memories was not something he assembled in a week. The technical capability he demonstrated in Season 1 was not improvised. He built all of it, over time, while being functionally invisible, and then, when the time came, he used it. That patience, unglamorous, quiet, invisible, is perhaps the most characterizing thing about him. Evil Morty is not characterized by rage or by drama. He's characterized by the capacity to wait. And the capacity to wait in a world designed to prevent Mortys from accumulating anything, power, knowledge, resources, options, is itself a form of defiance. Every day that passed while he was building toward his objective was a day the system expected to consume him the way it consumed other Mortys. The system counted on the anxiety, the dependence, the emotional entropy of the Rick/Morty relationship to keep Mortys where they were. Evil Morty didn't metabolize those pressures the way the system expected. Whether that makes him admirable or frightening probably depends on what you think about what he eventually does with the patience he accumulated. That's the question the show leaves open. It doesn't resolve it, it just puts the character in front of you and lets you sit with the discomfort of not being sure whether you're watching a liberation or a catastrophe, or both, because those aren't always different things. Section 2. Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. Season 1, Episode 10. Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. This is the episode where the structural reality of the Rick and Morty multiverse gets its first real articulation. Everything the show had done up to this point, the adventures, the portals, the alternate dimensions, the glimpses of other Ricks and Mortys, existed without a governing framework. The show had been big and chaotic and inventive, but it hadn't shown you the institution behind all of it. This episode does that. It introduces the Citadel of Ricks. It introduces the Council of Ricks. It introduces the idea that Rick C-137's independence is exceptional in a larger community of Ricks that operate collectively. And it introduces a character who will turn out to be the most important antagonist in the show's run. It does all of this in a 22-minute episode that's primarily structured as a mystery, and it does it so efficiently, so economically, that most of the character building for what eventually becomes a 5-season arc is accomplished in a single reveal moment that lasts about 30 seconds. Let's go through it. The episode opens in domestic chaos. Rick C-137 is doing something inadvisable in the garage. Morty is being pulled in multiple directions by a family that doesn't always know how to include him. This is baseline Season 1. The family dynamic is present, slightly messy, functioning as the emotional anchor for whatever's about to go wrong. What goes wrong is the arrival of other Ricks. 2 Ricks in official-looking uniforms portal into Rick C-137's garage. They're not here for a social call. They're operating on behalf of an institution. They have a warrant, or the Rick equivalent of one. They're apprehending Rick C-137 for a specific reason. He is the prime suspect in a series of murders. Someone is killing Ricks, and the evidence, assembled by the Council of Ricks, points to him. This is the episode's first significant piece of world building. The existence of Council Ricks, Ricks who act as agents of a governing body, who respond to directives, who operate within a chain of command, is new information. We've met various Ricks in previous episodes, but always as independent operators. The idea that there's a political structure for the Rick community, that there are Ricks who have opted into a system of shared governance, that Rick C-137 is being held accountable to an institution, all of this is being established here for the first time. Rick C-137's immediate response to being apprehended tells you a lot about his relationship with this institution. He does not go peacefully. He escapes. He grabs Morty, portals away, and is immediately a fugitive. His contempt for the Council's authority is bone deep and automatic. He doesn't argue his innocence or request due process. He runs. This tells you something important. Rick C-137's relationship with the Citadel is adversarial by default. He's not a neutral non-participant who
who simply prefers independence. He actively resists the Council's jurisdiction in a way that suggests history. There's a dynamic here that predates the episode's events. The Council and Rick C-137 have a complicated relationship, and his immediate flight response is part of that complication. While Rick C-137 and Morty are on the run, the episode establishes the murder mystery properly. Ricks are dying, multiple Ricks across multiple dimensions, killed in ways that suggest a targeted, organized operation. The deaths aren't random. They look like assassinations. Someone is hunting Ricks specifically and doing it with enough precision that the Council has been forced to act. The circumstantial evidence against Rick C-137 is built around his behavioral profile. He's the Rick who doesn't participate in Citadel governance. He doesn't show up to council meetings. He doesn't maintain cooperative relationships with other Ricks. He operates alone, makes unilateral decisions, and has demonstrated throughout his life that he thinks the rules of the Rick community don't apply to him. He's the kind of Rick who, if someone wanted to frame for something, would be an easy target. He has no institutional allies to advocate for him. He has no network of Ricks who would vouch for his character. He's built his life in a way that, in this particular situation, makes him a convenient scapegoat. The show is doing two things at once here. On the surface level, it's setting up a mystery. Who's really doing this, and why? At a deeper level, it's characterizing Rick C-137 through the profile the Council has assembled about him. This Rick is someone who chose isolation, someone who built his genius into a wall around himself rather than a bridge toward community. The Citadel doesn't like him, and the feeling is mutual. And this episode is where we understand that dynamic explicitly for the first time. The flight from the Council takes Rick C-137 and Morty through several dimensions, and along the way, the episode introduces us to other Rick/Morty pairs. Brief glimpses of alternate versions of the same relationship. Ricks and Mortys who are doing approximately what Rick C-137 and Morty do, in slightly different configurations. The redundancy of the pairing across dimensions is made visually explicit. There's a specific scene during the flight sequence that's worth pausing on. Rick C-137 uses Morty as camouflage in the literal, technical sense, staying close to him specifically to mask the brainwave signature. It's one of the clear, direct demonstrations in the early seasons of the brainwave dampening principle, and it operates as both a plot mechanism, they evade detection, and a characterization beat. Rick is using Morty as a tool, consciously, in the middle of a crisis. The show handles this with its usual deft ambiguity. Rick's use of Morty here is functional and slightly calculating. He's thought about this in advance. He knows that the closer Morty is, the harder he is to track. But there's also, in the way the scene plays, a dimension of genuine protection. He keeps Morty close, physically, in a way that's protective as well as strategic. The exploitation and the care coexist without the show resolving the tension between them. That unresolved tension is the show in miniature. The Council eventually captures them and brings them to the Citadel. The Citadel, as first seen in this episode, is enormous. The scale of it is communicated through wide establishing shots, a massive structure that exists outside normal dimensional space, accessible by portal, but not belonging to any single universe. It has the visual grammar of a city-state. There are crowds, there are districts, there are services and infrastructure, and the lived texture of a functioning society. And it is populated almost entirely by Ricks and their Mortys. Hundreds of Ricks visible in the establishing shots, maybe thousands, all recognizably Rick. Same basic body, same white hair, same lab coat, but differentiated in small ways. Different numbers on their uniforms, different expressions, different apparent ages, though they're all old. The visual variety within the uniformity communicates the idea of infinite Ricks more viscerally than any amount of dialogue could. The Mortys are present but peripheral in this first episode. They're there, attached to their Ricks, visible in the background of crowd scenes, but they're not foregrounded. The show, in this first Citadel appearance, is focused on the Rick power structure, the Council, the institutional authority, the way Ricks govern Ricks. The Mortys register as the background element they are within the Citadel's social logic, and the show lets that be the visual truth of the episode without commenting on it. This is important. The show is not yet ready to pull focus to the Morty population. It will. In season 3, it will spend an entire episode doing exactly that. But here, in the show's first Citadel appearance, it lets the visual hierarchy stand. Rick's in the foreground, Morty's in the background. The image of the episode confirms the social reality before the show has articulated it explicitly. The Council convenes to deal with Rick C-137. The Council of Ricks, as seen in this episode, is the Citadel's governing body. Multiple Ricks sitting in judgment of a
another Rick. The visual of this scene is deliberately absurd. Everyone at the table is Rick, and the show plays it for comedy. But the comedy sits on top of a real and uncomfortable observation. A body composed entirely of Ricks, judging one of their own by standards they set for themselves, is not a neutral institution. It's a self-selected group exercising power over their community in ways that serve their own interests. The Council's contempt for Rick C-137 is visible and not particularly disguised.
They don't like him. They don't respect him. His non-participation in Citadel governance is read as arrogance. A Rick who thinks himself above the community. The accusation of murder gives them official standing to act on that contempt. Whether he's guilty or not almost seems secondary to the fact that they finally have legitimate grounds to bring him in. Rick C-137, in response, is defiant. He doesn't acknowledge the Council's authority. He doesn't show deference. He argues from the evidence. Or rather, he argues that the evidence is wrong. That whoever is doing this knows him well enough to mimic his methods, but has gotten the mimicry slightly off. There are tells. The signature of the real killer isn't quite his signature. He can see it. The Council either can't or doesn't want to. This is the episode establishing Rick C-137's analytical intelligence, not just through action sequences, but through reasoning. He's doing detective work under pressure in front of a hostile tribunal while also managing the fact that Morty is present and scared. The multitasking of genius is one of the things the show consistently demonstrates about Rick, and this scene is an efficient early example. The murder mystery resolves through Rick C-137's investigation, rather than through the Council's. While he's being held and assessed, Rick C-137 is also looking, observing, taking in information about the Citadel, about the institutional dynamics, about who in the environment might have reason to set him up, and the capability to do it. The Council is following their process. He's following his mind. What he figures out is this: the real killer is using a Rick as a puppet, a Rick whose brain has been directly controlled, overridden essentially, so that his physical presence and his biological signature are available as camouflage for whoever is actually operating him. Someone external to the Citadel's tracking system used a controlled Rick as a mask, conducting operations through him in a way that left Rick's brainwave signature as the detectable element. From the outside, it looked like a Rick doing the killing. From the inside, something else was driving. To pull this off, you'd need the technology to override a Rick's cognitive functions. You'd need to understand the tracking systems well enough to know exactly what signature you were trying to mimic. You'd need enough knowledge of Rick C-137 specifically to mimic his behavioral patterns convincingly, and you'd need the operational capability to maintain the deception over multiple killings across multiple dimensions without detection. The sophistication required is Rick level, which is why, when the real operator is revealed, the reveal is as effective as it is. The reveal happens in the episode's climax. Rick C-137 has identified the controlled Rick as the source of the murders, but the episode hasn't yet shown you who's controlling him. When the situation breaks open, when the confrontation happens, and the controlled Rick is exposed, there's a moment where the actual operator becomes visible. A Morty, a young boy, removing an eye patch to reveal that he's been present throughout this, attached to the controlled Rick, indistinguishable within the Citadel's visual landscape from any other Morty accompanying any other Rick. He was right there. He was there the whole time. The eye patch is removed with the kind of quiet deliberateness that tells you this character knew exactly what he was doing. He's not panicking. He's not angry that he's been discovered. He looks, in the seconds the episode gives him, like someone who has already calculated whether this outcome matters for the larger picture he's working toward. And the conclusion that calculation produces is apparently this particular development doesn't stop him. He exits. He slips away in the chaos of the confrontation, and he's gone. This is the only image of Evil Morty that Season 1 gives us. A young face, an eye patch being removed, a moment of being seen, and then an absence. The show gives you that image and moves on. The episode resolves. Rick C-137 and Morty are cleared of the murders. The Council releases them without apology. Everyone goes home. And the question of who that Morty was, where he came from, and what he was trying to accomplish sits in the air, unanswered as Season 1 ends. Let's sit with what this reveal actually implies, because the episode doesn't spell it out, and the implications are enormous. The most obvious implication, a Morty pulled this off. Not a Rick, a Morty. The entity that the entire Citadel structure is built around, treating as camouflage, as signal interference, as a dampening field, used the system's own logic as a weapon and nearly succeeded in destroying Rick C-137 137's standing within the most powerful institution in the multiverse. He inverted the Rick/Morty dynamic. The normal configuration is a genius hiding inside a Morty's brainwave noise. He ran it in reverse, a Morty hiding inside a controlled Rick's brainwave signature. The system that was designed to make Rick's invisible also, in his hands, made him invisible. He found the exploit in the architecture and ran it perfectly. For that inversion to work, he needed to understand the system deeply. He needed to know how the tracking technology functioned at a technical level. He needed to know what Rick C137's signature looked like specifically, distinguishable enough from other Ricks to allow convincing mimicry. He needed the technology to control a Rick's cognitive functions, which is technology that most Mortys would never encounter, much less build or steal. And he needed the patience to run a sustained, multi-dimensional operation without getting caught. None of that is what a normal Morty would have. All of it is what someone who has spent years studying the system from the inside, learning its mechanics, understanding its vulnerabilities, and preparing to exploit them would have. The question of where he got that capability is one the show never fully answers, but there are things we can observe. He had access to technology. Either he built it, which implies a level of technical intelligence that would make him exceptional among Ricks, much less Mortys, or he acquired it from somewhere. Acquisition implies access to Rick-level resources at some point, which implies a history in which he was close enough to a Rick or to Rick-level infrastructure to learn what he needed and take what he needed. He had specific knowledge of Rick C137. He knew enough about C137's behavioral profile to construct a convincing frame. That's not general knowledge of how Ricks behave. That's knowledge of one Rick specifically, his reputation, his relationships, or lack of them, within the Citadel, his patterns of behavior, the exact reasons he would be a plausible suspect. That knowledge could come from intelligence gathering, from being in proximity to people who knew C137, or from some more direct exposure to C137's world. He had a plan that required choosing Rick C137 as the frame. Of all the Ricks in the multiverse, he picked this one. That choice was not random. Something about C137 made him the right target, either personally useful to frame for reasons related to Evil Morty's larger objectives, or selected because his profile made him the most convincing suspect, or both. The show doesn't answer these questions here. It files them under unknown and lets you carry them into the later seasons. But they're there. The specificity of what he did implies a history the show hasn't shown yet. The controlled Rick, the puppet who was used as the mechanism of the murders, is captured by the Council. The episode makes clear that this Rick was a victim as much as a tool, which adds a layer of complexity to what Evil Morty was willing to do. He didn't just use Ricks as targets. He used a Rick as a piece of equipment, overriding his cognitive functions and treating his body and his brainwave signature as resources to be exploited. The echo of what the Citadel does to Mortys is not subtle. Evil Morty, who was formed in a system that treats Mortys as equipment, used a Rick as equipment. Whether this represents a deliberate inversion on his part, a kind of dark symmetry, or whether it's simply the most efficient available method, the show doesn't say, but the parallel is there, visible in the structure of what he did. The Council acquires the controlled Rick. Evil Morty gets away. The Citadel's justice, such as it is, lands on the tool rather than the operator. The tool didn't choose what it was used for. Evil Morty chose everything, and Evil Morty is free. The episode ends with Rick C137 and Morty back home, cleared, the adventure concluded. The family dynamic reasserts itself. The chaos resolves. The show moves on. But somewhere in the multiverse, a Morty with an eye patch is free. He escaped. He watched the outcome from a safe distance. The episode implies he had the forethought to have an exit strategy ready if the operation was exposed, and he's already gone before the Council finishes processing what happened. He had a plan in Season 1. That plan was exposed before it fully completed, but the exposure didn't stop him. He lost one operation. He retained his freedom. Whatever he was doing, whatever the killings were part of, whatever his larger objective was, he's still out there, still working toward it. Season 2 passes without him. Season 3 begins without him. The Citadel continues without him. Its institutional memory of the event apparently insufficient to identify or locate the Morty who was operating behind the controlled Rick. And then, in Season 3, Episode 7, he comes back. Not as a shadow, not as a threat, as a candidate. There's something worth pausing on about the specific target Evil Morty chose for his operation. Rick C137. Not just any Rick. This specific Rick. The outlier. The one who refused Citadel membership. The one the Council already has a complicated relationship with. Already already views as a problem, already treats with thinly veiled contempt. Framing Rick C-137 for the murders is tactically elegant in a way that reveals careful thinking about institutional psychology. If you're going to frame a Rick for killing other Ricks, you want the frame to be believable, not just technically, but psychologically. You want the Ricks doing the investigation to find it easy to believe the accused is guilty. Rick C-137 is that Rick. His behavioral profile is a made-to-order frame. He's antisocial. He's contemptuous of Citadel authority. He has no documented relationships within the institution that would provide counter-evidence against a violent theory. He's the Rick that other Ricks already distrust. When the council assembled the evidence and it pointed at him, the institutional reflex was to believe it. That reflex is exactly what Evil Morty was designing against. This tells you something about how Evil Morty thinks. He doesn't just understand technology, he understands institutions. He understands the way collective bodies think and the biases they carry and the shortcuts they take when faced with evidence that confirms what they already suspected. The frame he constructed was engineered not just as a technical artifact, but as a psychological one. An artifact designed to land inside a specific institutional mindset and produce a specific institutional response. That kind of systems-level thinking is not something you develop overnight. It's the thinking of someone who has spent a long time observing an institution from close proximity, learning how it moves, learning what it believes, learning where its blind spots are. Evil Morty spent time inside the Citadel's world, long enough to understand it well enough to weaponize it against itself. The controlled Rick, the puppet mechanism, is worth thinking about in more detail. The show establishes that whoever was killing other Ricks was doing so from within the Rick community, using a Rick as the instrument. This means Evil Morty didn't just identify a target, he acquired a Rick. He placed that Rick under some form of cognitive control, substantial enough to direct his actions across multiple murder events. And he did so without the Citadel's detection systems catching the anomaly. The cognitive control technology implied here is significant. Ricks are, in the show's logic, exceptionally resistant to external influence, precisely because of their intelligence. Their brainwave signatures are distinctive and strong. The idea that a Morty not only acquired technology capable of overriding a Rick's cognition, but used it successfully enough to run a multi-dimensional operation without the controlled Rick breaking through the control or drawing attention to his condition, that's an extraordinary operational achievement. It also implies something about where Evil Morty was positioned relative to Rick-level technology at the time. You don't build or steal cognitive control technology from a position of total resource poverty. He had access to something at some point. Either he was in proximity to a Rick who developed such technology, or he encountered it in some other context, or he developed it himself. The show doesn't say, but the sophistication of what he deployed rules out improvisation. He had resources, he had knowledge, he had time to develop the capability. The question of how he got there, how a Morty arrived at a position where he had all of those things, is one of the genuinely fascinating open questions in the show's mythology. The answer, if it ever comes, would probably be the origin story the show has declined to give us. For now, the capability speaks for itself. What he could do is visible. How he came to be able to do it is not. Let's also consider what the operation was trying to accomplish beyond the obvious immediate objective of framing Rick C-137. On the surface, eliminate Ricks, frame C-137, use the resulting institutional chaos to advance some unknown objective. But if you think about it from the perspective of what Evil Morty eventually turns out to be building toward, the Season 1 operation looks like something more specific than a random act of chaos. Disrupting the Council, forcing the Citadel to turn on one of its most notable non-members, creating institutional conflict, learning how the Citadel's investigative mechanisms work by activating them, studying C-137's profile in enough depth to frame him convincingly. All of that is intelligence work. It's reconnaissance disguised as sabotage. The surface objective, get C-137 removed or imprisoned, may have been genuine, but the operational experience of running a multi-dimensional murder campaign against the Citadel, watching the institution's response, measuring the speed and quality of its investigation, understanding how the Council of Ricks reacts under pressure, that knowledge has long-term value that extends well beyond whatever immediate outcome the operation was designed to produce. Evil Morty, by Season 5, has built something capable of dismantling the most powerful institution in the accessible multiverse. You don't build that kind of operational capability without extensive intelligence about the target. The Season 1 operation may have been, among other things, an extended study. study, an active probe of the Citadel's defenses and procedures, the murders as information gathering, the frame as a stress test. If that's true, and the show doesn't confirm it, but it's consistent with everything we eventually learn about how Evil Morty thinks, then even in his Season 1 appearance, the thing the viewer sees as a bold, aggressive move was actually the cautious, methodical gathering of knowledge, which would make the boldness an illusion. Which is, of course, exactly what you'd expect from someone who has learned to hide in plain sight. There's one more element of the Season 1 episode worth sitting with before we move on, and it's the ending. Evil Morty escapes. The episode ends with his escape. The Council doesn't catch him. The Citadel's investigative apparatus, formidable enough to track and apprehend Rick C-137, is not formidable enough to catch a Morty who was operating as a concealed agent within the institution's own space.
He was close enough to be present at the climax of the confrontation. He was close enough that the controlled Rick's exposure should have implicated him, and he still got away. The ease of his escape says something about how the Citadel thinks about Mortys. An institution that treats Mortys as camouflage, as signal noise rather than as agents, is an institution that isn't looking for Mortys who are running independent operations. The category doesn't exist in the institutional imagination. You look for Rick actors. You look for the operator of a Rick puppet. When the puppet is exposed, you look for the proximate cause, and the proximate cause looks like a Rick. The Morty who is actually running the whole operation is outside the frame of what you're looking for. Evil Morty used the Citadel's conceptual blindness as his escape route. The same blindness that was designed to protect Rick's, the assumption that a Morty is camouflage, not an actor, protected him.
He walked out of the Citadel through the gap in its imagination, and the Citadel, having resolved the case, closed its file and moved on. He was invisible because the system had decided Mortys were invisible, and he was already using the system's definitions of what a Morty is against the system itself. Season 1 ends. He's gone. He'll be back. Section 3. The Citadel of Ricks. Between Evil Morty's first appearance in Season 1 and his return in Season 3, the show is doing something important. It's building out the Citadel, adding texture, adding institutional depth, adding the sociological detail that will make the Ricklantis Mixup land as hard as it does. And it's doing this not by following Evil Morty, who is absent, but by deepening our understanding of the world he was formed in. This section is about that world.
The Citadel of Ricks, its structure, its function, the social hierarchies that define life within it, and the specific ways it treats the Morty population. Because Evil Morty's arc is ultimately an arc about the Citadel, what it is, what it does to people, and what it would take to destroy it. You can't follow his story without understanding what he was reacting to. The Citadel of Ricks, as the show gradually reveals it, is the most powerful political structure in the accessible multiverse. It predates most of what we see in the series. It was built over an extended period by Ricks who recognized that coordinating the activities of an infinite community of geniuses had practical benefits that outweighed the philosophical discomfort of acknowledging that other Ricks existed and had legitimate claims. Its basic function is coordination and shared infrastructure. Across infinite dimensions, there are infinite Ricks. They're all geniuses. They're all independent. They all have their own agendas, their own research, their own grievances. Left completely unchecked, they'd be an infinite source of chaos. Every Rick doing whatever they want across every dimension simultaneously, competing for the same resources, creating cascading catastrophes, working against each other as often as they worked toward anything useful. The Citadel is the solution to that collective action problem. It provides shared infrastructure, portal technology at scale, research archives, shared defensive capabilities, access to resources no single Rick could acquire alone. In exchange, participating Ricks accept a loose governance structure, the Council of Ricks as the decision-making authority, certain rules about conduct within the Citadel, and the expectation that you'll show up when summoned. The benefits are real. The constraints are light enough that most Ricks find the trade acceptable. Community of Genius is not nothing. Being around other Ricks with access to their research and their accumulated knowledge has genuine value, even for a being who doesn't lack intelligence. Shared defensive capabilities matter in a multiverse that contains threats equal to or greater than any single Rick. The Citadel offers things that cooperation makes possible and independence doesn't. Rick C-137's refusal to participate, his contempt for the Council's authority, his choice to operate without Citadel affiliation is not the default Rick position. It's the exceptional position. Most Ricks participate, at least
least minimally, because the math of participation works in their favor. C-137 has reasons for his non-participation that the show eventually reveals are connected to his specific history. But the point is that non-participation is unusual. The Citadel has genuinely figured out how to make the value proposition attractive to beings who don't easily accept constraints. The Morty side of this arrangement is where you have to slow down, because it's different in character from the Rick side in a way that matters enormously. Ricks participate in the Citadel because it benefits them. They make a rational calculation. The constraints of membership are worth the benefits of shared infrastructure and community. It's a transaction. They get something, they give something. The exchange, while not entirely comfortable for beings as self-regarding as Ricks, is comprehensible as a cooperative arrangement. Mortys don't participate in that sense. Mortys are not making a rational transaction with the Citadel. Mortys exist within the Citadel structure because Ricks need them, and the Citadel is organized around serving Ricks. The Morty population of the Citadel is a dependent population, people whose presence is required by the system's functioning, but who are not participants in the governance of that system. They're accommodated in the way you'd accommodate a necessary piece of infrastructure. Not represented, not consulted, accommodated. The brainwave dampening function that makes Mortys valuable is not negotiated. It's not a service Mortys provide in exchange for compensation. It's a biological fact that the Citadel extracts through the structural mechanism of pairing. Ricks bring their Mortys to the Citadel manages the pairing process, and the biological reality of Morty's brainwave pattern does what it does because that's what it does. No transaction, no consent, just function. The assignment system is one of the first specific institutional mechanisms the show reveals about how the Citadel manages its Morty population. Mortys who arrive at the Citadel without an attached Rick, Mortys who have been separated from their original partners, or Mortys who were born or grew up within the Citadel without an initial pairing are held in the Citadel system as available for assignment. A Rick who needs a Morty can request one. The Citadel processes the request and provides a Morty. What this mechanism reveals is the absence of Morty agency in the pairing process. The assignment is not a mutual selection. The Morty doesn't interview Ricks. The Morty doesn't evaluate options and choose the partnership that seems safest or most compatible or most likely to result in the Morty's well-being being prioritized. The Morty is assigned. The Rick is provided a Morty. The language of the transaction positions Ricks as agents and Mortys as objects of those agents' decisions. There's no formal accountability built into the assignment structure either. Once a Morty is assigned to a Rick and goes off on adventures, there's no tracking mechanism for what the Morty experiences. There's no check-in. There's no standard of care that the Citadel enforces on Ricks vis-a-vis their Mortys. The assignment is made, and then the pair operates outside direct Citadel oversight, with all the potential for exploitation and harm that implies. When Mortys come back, when they return to the Citadel after adventures for whatever reason, the Citadel receives them, it processes them, and then, at some point, the same system that placed them the first time will place them again. There is no mechanism for a Morty to say, that was a harmful assignment, I would like to not be assigned to that kind of Rick again. There is no pathway for accumulated harm to change the terms of future assignments. The system processes Mortys through it repeatedly without accumulating concern for what the processing costs. The Morty School is one of the institutions the series references across multiple episodes, and it's worth examining because it's an example of the way the Citadel provides for its Morty population in ways that look like care and function as preparation for continued exploitation. Mortys at the Citadel attend school. They receive education. On the surface, this is positive. The Citadel is investing in the development of its Morty population, not just warehousing them. But education is not neutral. Education has a curriculum, and a curriculum has a purpose. And the purpose of the education provided to Mortys within the Citadel is to produce Mortys who function effectively within the Citadel's systems. The school is run by Ricks. This is the first tell. The educational authority over the Morty population is entirely Rick. Mortys are being taught by the same beings who benefit from their continued accommodation of the Citadel's logic. The content of what they're taught, the frame through which they're given to understand their situation, the narrative they're handed about what their role is and why is filtered through Rick perspective. There's no indication that the curriculum includes instruction in the Morty population's own history of exploitation. No indication that Mortys are taught to analyze the structures that govern their lives critically. No indication that the education offers the tools for the kind of systemic thinking that would allow
a Morty to see the Citadel from the outside, as a structure rather than as a natural environment. The education shapes Mortys to function within the existing order. That's what it's for. Evil Morty, who developed the capacity to see the Citadel from the outside, who did the systemic thinking that the education was apparently not designed to produce, either got that capacity from somewhere outside the standard educational track, or developed it in spite of that track, or both. The show doesn't specify, but the contrast between what the Morty school produces and what Evil Morty became is part of the picture the show is building. The Morty daycare is another institutional element that reveals the Citadel's logic in action. When Ricks go on adventures that are too dangerous for a Morty to accompany, or when the brainwave dampening isn't needed for a particular trip, Mortys can be deposited at what functions as a daycare. They're watched, kept occupied, managed, and then picked up when their Rick returns. The comedy of the Morty daycare, deployed at various points in the series, sits on top of a reality that isn't particularly funny on inspection. The logic of the daycare is the logic of a storage facility. Mortys are deposited and retrieved. The facility exists not for the Mortys' benefit, it's not designed to be enriching or developmental for them, but for the Rick's convenience. A Rick who needs to go somewhere without a Morty needs a place to put the Morty. The Citadel provides that. The Mortys who spend time in the daycare experience it as an interruption. They're waiting for their Rick. Their sense of their own situation is defined by the absence of the Rick who will eventually return and take them somewhere else. Their psychological frame within this institution is one of suspension, waiting for the next thing their Rick will do. This is not presented as unusually cruel. It's presented as normal. The show's horror, in its quieter moments, is consistently the horror of normalization. The way systems produce suffering through regular procedures that nobody designed to be harmful, but that function harmfully because the people inside them aren't the system's primary concern. There's a social hierarchy within the Morty population itself that the Ricklantis Mixup later reveals, but the groundwork for it is laid in the earlier establishment of the Citadel's logic. Mortys who are actively partnered with Ricks, who travel regularly, who are integrated into the adventuring life, occupy a different social position than Mortys who have become detached, or who have never been assigned, or who have been returned to the Citadel by Ricks who are done with them. The hierarchy is not formally codified, but it operates in the informal social dynamics of the Citadel's Morty population. Being actively adventuring with a Rick is, in the Citadel's value system, the normative Morty status. A Morty fulfilling the function, providing brainwave cover, accompanying the adventures, doing what Mortys do, is a Morty in good standing with the system. A Morty who has been separated from that function, for whatever reason, is a Morty in an ambiguous position, present in the Citadel but not performing the central role, tolerated but not integrated. This informal hierarchy creates pressure on Mortys to accept reassignment even when previous assignments have been harmful. The alternative, remaining unassigned, existing within the Citadel without a partner Rick, being categorized as a Morty without a clear function, carries social costs that the institutional pressure is designed to avoid. The system doesn't need to coerce. The social logic it creates does the work of coercion without requiring explicit force. One more dimension of the Citadel's structure worth establishing before we move forward: its relationship with memory and institutional knowledge. The Citadel maintains records, archives, institutional memory about Ricks, about operations, about events in the multiverse. This is one of its most significant resources: the accumulated knowledge of countless Ricks operating across countless dimensions over an extended period. The Citadel knows things. It has access to information that no individual Rick, no matter how brilliant, could accumulate alone. But institutional memory is also selective. It preserves what the institution values and allows to erode what it doesn't. The Citadel's archives are organized around Rick activity, Rick research, Rick operations. The Morty population doesn't generate the same kind of detailed institutional record. What happens to Mortys, the specifics of their assignments, their experiences, their histories, is not systematically preserved. This selective memory matters for Evil Morty's story in a specific way. His appearance in Season 1 created a record of some kind. A Morty operating a controlled Rick, conducting murders, escaping, but somewhere between Season 1 and Season 3, that record apparently didn't produce identification. Nobody connected the Season 1 event to the candidate running for president in Season 3. The institutional memory either failed to preserve the connection, or Evil Morty worked to make sure it couldn't be made. Either possibility tells you something. If the memory failed on its own, it tells you the Citadel's record keeping of Morty-related events is genuinely poor, consistent with the general pattern pattern of Morty's not being the Citadel's primary institutional concern. If Evil Morty suppressed it, it tells you that his access to the Citadel's archives at some point before or during his presidency was sufficient to manage his own historical trace. Both things might be true. The Citadel might keep poor records of Morty-related incidents, and Evil Morty might have made use of that poor record-keeping to clean up what trace did exist. The combination would explain how he could run for president of the institution he'd previously attacked without anyone making the connection. The relationship between the Citadel and the Galactic Federation deserves a brief mention because it establishes the Citadel as operating within a larger political context. The Galactic Federation, encountered at various points in the series, is a multi-species governing body that has historically been in tension with the Citadel of Ricks. The Federation represents one model of multiverse governance, a broad coalition of species operating under shared rules. The Citadel represents another, a community of a single type of entity organized for their own benefit, operating outside the Federation's jurisdiction. The political dynamics between them are complex, and the show doesn't resolve them cleanly. What matters for our purposes is this: the Citadel exists in a competitive political environment. It's not the only power in the multiverse. It maintains its independence through capability. Its Ricks are individually and collectively among the most powerful actors in the accessible multiverse, and through the strategic management of its relationships with other power centers. This context matters because it shapes what the Citadel is designed to protect. It's not just a community center for Ricks. It's a political institution that maintains its members' independence and capability against external threats. The governance structure it maintains, the rules it enforces, the infrastructure it provides, all of it serves the end of preserving Rick's sovereignty in a multiverse that contains other powerful entities. When Evil Morty comes along and destroys the Citadel from within, he's not just ending a social club, he's ending the primary institutional defense of the Rick community's position in the multiverse. The consequences of that extend well beyond the Citadel's own population. The assignment system that the Citadel used to pair Ricks with Mortys is worth understanding in detail because the mechanics of it reveal a lot about how the institution thought about what a Morty was. It wasn't informal. It wasn't left to individual Ricks to source their own Morty from wherever they could find one. It was administered. There was a bureaucracy for it. Mortys were maintained in reserve pools. When a Rick needed a new Morty because his previous one had died, or been too damaged to continue, or aged out of the range where the dampening worked most effectively, he went to the assignment office and received a new one. The Morty was processed in, documented, assigned a designation, and transferred. The Rick got a tool. The Morty got a life that the system had already defined for him before he arrived. The show depicts elements of this administrative apparatus in various episodes, always in passing, always treating the bureaucracy as background texture rather than as a subject in its own right. But the texture accumulates. You see Morty processing infrastructure. You see the language the Citadel uses to describe Mortys in institutional contexts, language that talks about assignment, deployment, service life, wear, and replacement rates. These are the words of an institution that has transformed a living relationship into a resource management problem. The workers in this system aren't portrayed as villains. They're portrayed as people doing their jobs. The individual administrators processing Mortys through the system aren't making a philosophical choice to dehumanize them. They're operating within an institutional framework that has already made that philosophical choice generations earlier and calcified it into procedure. The evil, if that's the right word, is structural. It exists in the system's assumptions, not in the personal motivations of everyone operating within it. This distinction matters for understanding Evil Morty's response. He's not angry at individual Ricks who are personally cruel to their Mortys. He's responding to the structure, the underlying assumptions that the entire institution is built on. Reforming the bad Ricks within the system wouldn't address what he's reacting to. The system itself would keep producing the same outcomes regardless of who was operating it. The education system the Citadel ran for Mortys is another piece of the institutional picture that the show introduces and then leaves as background. Morty's School, the institution where Citadel Mortys were educated between assignments, appears in the Ricklantis Mixup as the setting for the unassigned Morty storyline. It's staffed by Ricks. The curriculum is not shown in detail, but the context makes certain things clear. Mortys at Morty's School are being educated within an institution whose existence is premised on the idea that Mortys have a specific role. The education isn't oriented toward helping Mortys become whatever they want to be. It's oriented
oriented toward producing Mortys who are functional in the role the system has defined for them, anxious enough to dampen effectively, compliant enough to follow their assigned Rick, capable enough to be useful on adventures without being a liability. The school doesn't produce independent agents, it produces good Mortys. And a good Morty, in the Citadel's definition, is a Morty who has internalized their function and can perform it reliably. The education system is a reproduction machine for the system's labor requirements, not in the crude sense of producing physically identical workers, but in the subtler sense of producing psychologically prepared ones. Evil Morty, whatever his educational history, did not produce a good Morty. Something in his formation, whether the specific Rick he was paired with, or the specific experiences he had on adventures, or some combination of factors the show has left unspecified, produced instead a Morty who looked at the school, looked at the assignment system, looked at the adventure death rates, and decided that the entire framework was wrong. Not unfortunate, not occasionally cruel, wrong at the level of its fundamental premises. You don't arrive at that conclusion by going through the system as designed. You arrive at it by having enough distance from the system to see it from outside, even while you're living inside it. Whatever gave Evil Morty that distance, the show declines to tell us. But the distance itself is visible in everything he does. The geography of the Citadel matters too. The show reveals it as a place with distinct districts, different zones with different purposes and different populations. There are the upper districts, where established Ricks operate in relative comfort, with access to research infrastructure and the services the Citadel provides. There are the working class zones, where the labor economy plays out, where Mortys work the factories and Ricks, who didn't rise to prominence, do the technical and administrative work that keeps the institution running. And there are the worst off areas, the districts the cop storyline in the Ricklantis Mixup passes through, places where the institutional promises mean least and the structural neglect is most visible. This geography is a map of the Citadel's hierarchy made spatial. The institution's values are legible in how it organizes physical space, who gets the resources, who gets the services, whose neighborhood gets policed aggressively, and whose gets protected. The Citadel's architecture encodes its priorities just as much as its official policies do, and the priorities are consistent. Ricks who have accumulated institutional standing are at the center, and everyone else, Mortys especially, and lower status Ricks too, lives in the margins. Evil Morty would have navigated these spaces as an entity who existed within the Citadel's world at some point, who operated as a concealed agent during the Season 1 events, who then moved through the political process to the highest office. He would have moved across the geography of the institution and understood what it communicated. The spatial hierarchy was additional evidence for the structural argument he was making. You didn't have to read the policy documents. You could just look at where different populations lived. The Citadel also had external relationships that complicated the picture of it as a purely internal institution. Its relationship with the Galactic Federation, the other major governing structure in the show's multiverse, shifted over the course of the series. At certain points, they were adversarial. At others, they had working arrangements. The Council of Ricks was capable of negotiating at a governmental level, which means the Citadel was recognized by other institutions as a legitimate authority. This external legitimacy mattered for the Citadel's self-conception. It wasn't just a club of geniuses with shared infrastructure. It was a recognized political entity. It had standing in the larger institutional landscape of the multiverse. That standing reinforced the internal hierarchy. If external actors treated the Citadel as a legitimate governing body, then the governance structures it maintained internally were, by extension, legitimate too. The external recognition recycled back into internal authority. Evil Morty's destruction of the Citadel didn't just eliminate a domestic institution, it eliminated a recognized external actor from the multiverse's institutional landscape. The implications of that elimination extend beyond the Citadel's internal population to the broader structure of multiverse governance. What fills the gap the Citadel left in terms of the institutional relationships it had maintained with the Galactic Federation and other entities is one of the open questions the post-Curve multiverse is left with. Section 4, The Ricklantis Mixup, Season 3, Episode 7, The Ricklantis Mixup, also broadcast under the title Tales from the Citadel. There's an argument to be made that this is the single most important episode of Rick and Morty for understanding what the show is actually about at its deepest level. Not the most entertaining episode, not the most emotionally devastating, not the funniest, the most structurally important, the one that takes everything the show has been building about the Citadel and puts it on the table. It does something that nothing in the series had done before it. It spends an entire episode inside the Citadel following characters who are not Rick C-137 and not his Morty. It takes the institution that we'd seen as a backdrop, as the place Rick and Morty escaped from in Season 1, as the setting for the Council's machinations, and makes it the subject. Not a setting, a subject. The result is an episode that is, by any objective standard, one of the best pieces of animated television made in the decade it aired. And it ends with a twist that is, in retrospect, the most important single narrative event in Evil Morty's arc. Let's go through it carefully. By Season 3, the Citadel has been through significant disruption. The Season 3 premiere, the episode that resets the entire status quo of the show, involves Rick C-137 manipulating multiple power structures simultaneously. The Galactic Federation, which had imprisoned him at the end of Season 2, is brought down. The Council of Ricks, which had maintained the Citadel's governance structure, is destroyed in the same operation. The specifics of how that destruction happens are part of a sequence that demonstrates Rick C-137's planning at its most terrifying. He engineered the outcome from inside a prison with no apparent resources in what amounts to a single, sustained improvisation that leaves every institution that held power over him in rubble. The Council of Ricks, specifically, is eliminated as a governing body. Its individual members are presumably still alive across their various dimensions, but as a collective institution, it's finished. This creates a governance crisis for the Citadel. The institution doesn't have a mechanism for operating without the Council, because the Council was the institution's governing structure. In the aftermath of Season 3's premiere, the Citadel has to rebuild. It has to create new governance. And the form that new governance takes is the democratic experiment introduced in the Ricklantis Mixup, a presidential election. For the first time in the Citadel's history, the governing authority will be elected rather than assumed. And for the first time, Mortys are candidates. Mortys can run. Mortys can vote. This is a significant change on paper. Democracy is, nominally, a system of equal political participation. Everyone gets a vote. Everyone has standing to seek office. Introducing democracy into the Citadel is, on the surface, the Citadel opening up, acknowledging that the Morty population has standing, giving them formal institutional participation that they'd never had. The episode's job is to show you what that democratic experiment actually looks like in practice, given the context of the deep structural inequalities it's being introduced into, and what it shows is not encouraging. The episode has multiple storylines running simultaneously. This is the episode's formal structure. Several narrative threads, each following different characters in different parts of the Citadel, each illuminating a different dimension of the institution's social reality. The threads don't fully converge until the episode's end, when the election results are revealed and the twist lands. Let's follow each thread in turn. The first thread follows two Rick police officers. One of them is a Rick the episode calls Simple Rick, a Rick who made the unconventional choice to abandon the genius-driven life and settle for something quiet. He gave up the multiverse-spanning adventures, gave up the experiments, gave up the ambition that all Ricks are supposed to share, and chose instead a small and genuinely happy family life. A daughter, a home, simple pleasures. Within the Citadel's value system, this makes Simple Rick a failure. All Ricks are supposed to want what Ricks want: the pursuit of knowledge, the expansion of capability, the exercise of genius in ever larger arenas. A Rick who chose a small life is a Rick who betrayed the category. Other Ricks look at Simple Rick with contempt that has the particular quality of contempt that comes from a person choosing something you didn't choose. It's not just judgment, it's something more uncomfortable. The episode follows Simple Rick's story to a conclusion that illustrates exactly what happens to deviations from the Rick norm within the Citadel's economy. Simple Rick's genuine happiness, the authentic contentment he found in the small life he chose, has been recognized by the Citadel as a resource to be extracted. There is a factory that produces a commercial product from Simple Rick's captured joy. His inner experience of happiness has been industrialized. He is kept in a machine that harvests his contentment and processes it into a snack food called Simple Rick's Wafer Cookies. This is the episode working at its most horrifying. The Citadel found a Rick who had something it didn't value, happiness achieved through smallness rather than achievement, and found a way to monetize that thing by taking it from the person who generated it. Simple Rick didn't choose to donate his happiness to the Citadel's economy. He's trapped, wired into a harvesting device, existing in a medically maintained state of
of remembered joy, while the Citadel runs his contentment as a profit center. The second thread follows a working-class Morty employed in the Simple Rick wafer factory. He's on the production line. He's doing the physical labor of the factory, which exists to produce a snack made from a Rick's harvested emotional content. He works hard. He follows the rules. He has aspirations. He wants to advance, to move up in the factory hierarchy, to reach a position where his capabilities are recognized. The thread follows his efforts to navigate the factory's social hierarchy and the Citadel's broader economic system. He encounters the reality of the Citadel's class structure firsthand. The positions of authority and advancement within the factory are occupied by Ricks. Not every Rick in the Citadel is powerful. The factory has management-level Ricks who are barely a step above their Morty employees in terms of actual social standing. But even relatively powerless Ricks occupy the supervisory roles that Mortys aspire to. This Morty's story ends with a moment of revelation. He discovers what the factory is actually producing and how it works, what Simple Rick's condition is, what the wafers are made from, what the whole operation represents. It's a crystallizing moment. The system he's been working within, that he's been trying to advance within, is built on the exploitation of someone's inner life. And having seen that, the structural logic of the whole Citadel economy becomes visible to him in a way it hadn't been before. What he does with that revelation, and the options available to him, constitute the thread's conclusion. The episode is not optimistic about the options a Morty has when he understands something the system would prefer he not understand. The third thread follows a different Morty in a different situation. This Morty is a student, recently graduated from the Morty school, trying to navigate the Citadel's social landscape without a Rick partner. He's alone, not assigned, existing in the Citadel system as a Morty without a function. He encounters other unassigned Mortys who have organized themselves into a small community, a group of Mortys living outside the assigned to a Rick structure, trying to build something independent. This thread explores what the Citadel's peripheral spaces look like. The Mortys living outside the assignment structure don't have the resources that come with Rick affiliation, don't have the institutional standing, don't have the social protection. They're operating in the margins. They've found each other, which creates something real, genuine community, genuine solidarity, but they're doing it without the Citadel's support, and often in the face of the Citadel's indifference or active hostility. The thread follows this group of Mortys through an event that tests the community they've built. The outcome illustrates the vulnerability of anything Mortys build within a system that doesn't recognize Morty welfare as a priority. The Citadel doesn't need to actively destroy what they've made. The structural conditions of their existence, the way the system allocates resources and recognition, do enough damage on their own. The fourth thread, and the one most directly relevant to Evil Morty's story, follows the presidential election. Multiple candidates are running. Rick candidates, with their various platforms and promises, and Morty candidates, because for the first time, Mortys are allowed to run for the Citadel's highest office. The episode shows us the campaign, the rhetoric, the rallies, the debates. It gives us the democratic process in sufficient detail to show that the process is functioning at a procedural level. Votes will be counted, a winner will be determined, the result will be binding. One of the Morty candidates is notable for the quality of his campaign. He connects. He speaks to both Ricks and Mortys in ways that seem genuine. He diagnoses the Citadel's problems accurately. The exploitation of Mortys, the class structure, the gap between what the institution promises and what it delivers to its Morty population. He articulates grievances that are real, and his articulation of them resonates with people who have been living those grievances. His campaign generates momentum. Polls shift. Ricks, who might not have been expected to vote for a Morty candidate, are persuadable. Mortys, who have never had political representation, see something that looks like possibility. The episode shows you this building, genuinely, in a way that invests you in the outcome. You start to wonder if the democratic experiment might actually produce something meaningful. The episode is letting you want this. That's part of what makes the reveal so effective. The election results come in at the end of the episode. The Morty candidate wins. He is going to be the first Morty president of the Citadel. And then the episode reveals who he is. This is Evil Morty. He's been running the campaign. He's been making the speeches. He's been connecting with voters, diagnosing problems accurately, building the coalition that won the election, and he's been doing it as a cover for something else entirely. The episode cuts between Evil Morty receiving the election results and images of the other Morty candidates, the other Mortys who ran against him. They're dead, in the void of space, disposed of. Evil Morty didn't just run a campaign, he also eliminated the
competition. He won both the legitimate contest and the illegitimate one he ran simultaneously. His victory is built on real political skill and on murder, and the two things coexist in him without apparent cognitive dissonance. The specific mechanics of this reveal are worth examining because they tell you something about how Evil Morty thinks. He ran a real campaign. He didn't simply bribe officials or stuff ballot boxes or use purely corrupt means. He actually campaigned. He gave real speeches. He developed real policy positions. He built real coalition. He was genuinely persuasive because the things he said were genuinely true. The Citadel does exploit Mortys. The class structure is genuinely unfair. The gap between Citadel promises and Citadel reality for the Morty population is genuine. He used accurate analysis of a real problem as the vehicle for a plan that had nothing to do with solving that problem. That's a particular kind of intelligence, the ability to tell the truth as a tactical maneuver, the ability to speak to genuine suffering without any intention of alleviating it, and to do so convincingly enough that the people whose suffering you're describing trust you. He won because he was the best candidate and because he killed his competition. Both things are true. He couldn't guarantee victory with only one of those methods, so he ran both simultaneously. He is disciplined enough to maintain a public campaign persona while conducting a covert operation in parallel. He can hold both things at once without the seams showing. The episode ends with Evil Morty's victory speech. He stands at the podium, newly elected, president of the most powerful institution in the multiverse, and he gives the speech. He talks about unity. He talks about change. He talks about what the Citadel could be if it actually honored the community it claimed to serve. It's a good speech. He delivers it well, and the episode holds two images simultaneously: the speech and the bodies floating in space, the promise and the cost of the promise. He's president of the Citadel. He's been planning something for a very long time. He just secured access to everything he needs to finish it. There's another layer to the Citadel's Morty system that the show builds in gradually. The question of what happens to Mortys when they're no longer useful. The adventure damage is cumulative. A Morty who has been on enough dangerous missions, who has absorbed enough trauma, who has witnessed enough impossible things, that Morty becomes compromised. Their brainwave dampening function degrades as their psychological state becomes more unstable. An anxious Morty is useful. A traumatized, broken Morty is less so. The show doesn't dwell on what happens to those Mortys within the Citadel's bureaucratic logic, but the implications of the labor economy the Citadel has built are not hard to follow. When a resource loses its utility, institutions find ways to manage that loss. Sometimes that means warehousing. Sometimes it means replacement. The Citadel's casual relationship with Morty welfare, the way individual Mortys move through the system as assets rather than as people, implies an institutional infrastructure for handling Mortys who can't perform their function anymore. This is the context in which Evil Morty's intelligence work across the seasons should be understood. He didn't just accumulate anger at the system. He accumulated specific, detailed knowledge of how the system operated, including the parts of it that the Citadel preferred not to make visible: the labor economy, the adventure death toll, the processing of Mortys who couldn't continue. He knew all of it, and he filed all of it as evidence for the case he was building. The Ricklantis Mixup does something that no previous episode had done. It takes the Citadel seriously as a society, not as a background location, not as an institutional antagonist, but as a place where lives are lived, where people make choices within constraints, where systems produce outcomes that are sometimes tragic and sometimes darkly absurd, and sometimes both. The three storylines that run through the episode are structured as a survey, different slices of Citadel life, each illuminating a different part of what the institution is and does. The cop storyline follows two police Ricks, one old and cynical, one new and still idealistic, as they work through a night in the Citadel's worst districts. The factory storyline follows Mortys who work the assembly lines, building the gadgets and widgets that fund the Citadel's operation, dreaming of something better but hemmed in by the system's indifference. The unassigned Morty storyline follows a Morty who doesn't have a Rick, trying to find his way through a society that has no category for what he is. Each storyline ends badly, in a different way. The idealistic Rick becomes complicit in the old cynical system he'd hoped to reform. The factory Morty's aspirations get used against them and turned into a mechanism of control. The unassigned Morty gets assigned to a situation he didn't choose and can't escape. The episode is a methodical demonstration that the Citadel is not a system
system that can be improved from within. Not because the people in it are all bad, but because the structure itself produces these outcomes regardless of individual intention. The election storyline runs parallel to these three narratives and cuts back to it periodically as the episode progresses. A political campaign inside the Citadel, a genuinely contested election for the presidency with multiple Morty candidates appealing to the Morty voter base and Rick candidates appealing to the Rick establishment. What the episode does quietly, over the course of its runtime, is show you the dynamics of a political campaign that looks familiar in broad strokes, but operates in a specific institutional context. The Morty candidates are appealing to hope. They're speaking to the genuine grievances of the Morty population, the adventure deaths, the labor exploitation, the second-class status. They're promising change. The Rick candidates are promising stability, competence, the continuation of structures that work, for certain definitions of work. Into this landscape, Evil Morty walks as a Morty candidate, and he wins. The episode ends with his victory, but the episode also shows you, in the final moments, the bodies, the cost. He didn't win this election by being the most compelling political figure. He won it by being the most operationally capable one, by understanding the institution well enough to identify and remove the threats to his candidacy with the same precision he'd used in Season 1 against Rick C-137. The victory speech is brilliant in a political sense. It offers the Morty voters exactly what they came to hear: unity, change, the possibility of a Citadel that actually honors its stated values. The speech is good. He means none of it in the way they think he means it. He needed the presidency for what it gives him access to, not for what it allows him to do on behalf of the Morty population he's ostensibly championing. The show holds the speech and the bodies simultaneously. It doesn't try to reconcile them. It just shows you both and lets you sit with the discomfort of a character who is completely correct in his diagnosis of the system and completely willing to use that system's tools, including the tool of democratic hope, in service of an objective that has nothing to do with improving the system for anyone but himself. Let's go back into the Ricklantis Mixup and look at the three storylines more carefully because they're constructed in parallel for a reason. The episode isn't just showing you three different parts of Citadel life independently, it's showing you three different versions of the same dynamic. A person with genuine aspirations encounters the system and is absorbed by it. The cop Rick starts the episode as a Rick who still believes in something. He wants to do the job right. He wants to be one of the Ricks who uses the institution to make things better rather than just to maintain the existing arrangement. He partners with a Morty cop, an unusual pairing, Morty as law enforcement rather than as tool, and they work through a shift together. Over the course of the night, the old cynical Rick partner guides him through a series of situations where the right thing to do and the practical thing to do are different, and each time the choice is made for expediency. By the end, the new Rick has done something he can't take back. The system didn't corrupt him dramatically, it just kept presenting him with small choices that accumulated into a larger one. The factory Mortys are working a legitimate grievance through what they believe is a legitimate channel. They found a Morty who claims to be the prophesied one true Morty, a figure from Morty folk religion who is supposed to lead them out of servitude. The episode is ambivalent about whether this Morty is genuine or an opportunist. Probably the latter, the show implies. But the workers' belief is genuine. They organize around him. They follow him. And the ending of their storyline is a catastrophe. The one true Morty is revealed to be, or is simply used as, a tool of management control. The hope the workers invested in collective action is turned back against them as a mechanism of suppression. The unassigned Morty's story is the simplest and the most direct. He's a Morty without a Rick. In the Citadel system, this is a category error. Mortys exist in relation to Ricks, and a Morty without a Rick is a Morty who has no place in the institutional logic. The episode follows him trying to find a place, through education, through social connection, through the political process, and ends with him being assigned, not to a future he chose, to a Rick who is exactly as bad as the Citadel's worst produced specimens. The system resolved his anomaly by making him fit the category he'd been trying to escape. These three storylines are the context in which Evil Morty's presidential victory lands. The episode has shown you, methodically, that the system absorbs and neutralizes internal challenges. The cop becomes complicit, the labor organizers are managed, the anomalous Morty gets assigned, and then, at the end, a Morty wins an election and gives a speech about change, and the floating bodies are visible in the same frame as the applause. The episode episode doesn't think things are about to get better for the Citadel's population. It's showing you a more sophisticated version of the absorption it's been demonstrating throughout. The absorption of democratic hope itself. The election, the vote, the possibility of reform. These are being used as instruments of control too, just with Evil Morty's particular objectives at the end of the line rather than the old guards. There's one more element of the Ricklantis Mixup that tends to get less attention than the election storyline. The very specific detail of how Evil Morty positions himself in the campaign. He doesn't run as the most revolutionary candidate. He runs as the Morty who is most genuinely credible to both the Morty voter base and to those Ricks who find the idea of Morty governance less threatening than the alternatives. His campaign rhetoric is calibrated. He speaks to Morty grievances without being inflammatory. He presents himself as a candidate for unity. A Morty who can bridge the community's divisions rather than sharpen them. He's not the radical. He's the moderate with a credible base. This is a level of political sophistication that goes beyond understanding what voters want to hear. It requires understanding the psychological landscape of an entire institution, what the different constituencies fear, what they hope for, what the threshold is between aspirational enough to be appealing and threatening enough to generate organized opposition. Evil Morty found the position in that landscape that was most viable, not the most honest position, and not the position closest to his actual objectives, the most viable one. He was running a complete political strategy, not just delivering a good speech, and the strategy worked. He won an election inside an institution populated almost entirely by beings who are defined by their intelligence, in a campaign environment where most of the candidates were Ricks who had access to institutional resources and information that he didn't. He won anyway. That victory, separate from everything else Evil Morty does, is its own demonstration of capability. Not the capability to destroy things, the capability to navigate and manipulate complex social institutions through superior understanding of how they think and what they respond to. Section 5. President Morty. Evil Morty wins the election in Season 3, Episode 7, and then disappears from the screen again. Season 4 comes and goes without him. The presidency happens off-screen. Whatever he's doing in office, the show doesn't follow it directly. It trusts you to hold the knowledge of what he is, to carry the Season 3 reveal forward through a season that doesn't mention him, and then to understand, in Season 5, what 2 years of his presidency actually produced. This section is about the presidency, not what we're shown of it, because we're not shown much, but what we can understand about it from the results, from what Season 5 reveals, and from what we know about how Evil Morty operates. The question to start with is, what does the presidency actually give him? President of the Citadel is a new position. It replaced the Council of Ricks as the governing authority after the Council's destruction in the Season 3 premiere. The Council was a collective body, multiple Ricks governing together, with the institutional weight and the accumulated authority of the group. The presidency is different. It's a single executive, one person, accountable to an elected process, holding the central governing authority. For Evil Morty, the presidency is access. Access to the Citadel's institutional infrastructure, to its intelligence apparatus, to its research archives, to its portal technology systems, to the accumulated knowledge and records of an institution that has been operating across infinite dimensions for an extended period. He can request information and receive it. He can direct resources and they'll be directed. He can access secure records without needing to steal them because he has legitimate standing as the governing authority to look at anything the institution holds. For someone who, in Season 1, needed to hack the system and use a controlled puppet just to operate within the Citadel, this is an almost incomprehensible upgrade. He went from working in the shadows with stolen tools to being the person who signs off on what the institution does. The legitimacy he now has is the same legitimacy he spent Season 1 evading. What is he looking for now that he has access to everything? The answer becomes clear in Season 5, but we can work toward it from what we know. Evil Morty has been planning across multiple seasons an operation that requires understanding the Central Finite Curve, what it is, how it was built, and how it could be broken. He knows the curve exists. He knows it's the foundational architecture of the Rick-organized multiverse. He knows that destroying it is the only way to actually escape the structure he was born into, rather than just moving around within it. To break the curve, he needs specific technical information, not general information about dimensional travel or portal technology. The Citadel has plenty of that. He needs the specific technical picture
of how the curve was constructed, the architectural details, the foundational mechanism, the specific piece of knowledge that, if you had it, would tell you where the wall is and what it's made of and where you could push to make it fail. That knowledge isn't in the Citadel's public archives. It's not something the institution has published in its research databases or handed around to its members. It's deep infrastructure knowledge held by whoever was involved in the curve's original construction. And the trail of that knowledge, when Evil Morty follows it through the Citadel's records, leads to Rick C-137. C-137's presence in the history of the curve is something Evil Morty spends his presidency uncovering and documenting. Not just reading a file, constructing a picture. The Citadel's records are fragmentary. The curve's construction is old. The specific memories and knowledge that constitute the technical picture of how it was built are distributed across multiple sources, and some of the most important pieces are not in institutional archives at all. They're in C-137's personal memory, the things he lived through, the choices he made, the events that shaped him into the specific Rick he became. Evil Morty's intelligence operation against C-137, which the season 5 finale reveals has been extensive, involves gathering every available piece of information about C-137's history, his movements, his relationships, his recorded adventures, his known contacts, and something more, his memories, which the show reveals Evil Morty has accessed and reconstructed in some form. The mechanics of how one accesses another being's memories are not fully explained, but the show establishes that Evil Morty has done it, that the reconstruction is substantial, and that the resulting picture is what he uses to finally confront C-137 in the season 5 finale. The presidency gave him the standing and the resources to conduct this intelligence operation at scale. It gave him the time, 2 years of uninterrupted access to the Citadel's apparatus to do it properly, and it gave him the ability to do it without anyone asking what the president was researching or why. Let's think about what governing the Citadel actually looks like for someone with Evil Morty's objectives. He is not governing for governance's sake. He didn't want the presidency because he cared about administration. He wanted it for access and for positioning, but he still has to govern because ceasing to govern, becoming visibly derelict in the executive role, would create scrutiny he doesn't want. So he governs, minimally, efficiently. He keeps things running at a level that doesn't produce crises requiring close attention, doesn't generate the kind of political controversy that would bring external pressure on his administration, doesn't give anyone a reason to look closely at what the president is actually doing. This is not passive. Governing minimally in an institution as complex as a Citadel requires active management of a specific kind. You have to know which things need attention and which things can be allowed to run on autopilot. You have to know which officials need to be kept satisfied and which can be ignored. You have to manage the political relationships that keep your authority stable without investing more in those relationships than they require. Evil Morty is capable of this. His entire career demonstrates the ability to maintain multiple layers of activity simultaneously, the visible layer and the actual layer, without the seams showing. The presidential persona, the governing executive, can coexist with the operational planner gathering the materials for the finale without either compromising the other. The Mortys who voted for him are living in a Citadel governed by someone who doesn't care about them. The Ricks who accepted his legitimacy are operating within an institution run by someone whose plan ends with that institution's destruction. None of them know. He's holding the secret cleanly, running the cover story efficiently, moving toward the objective on a timeline no one else can see. There's something worth observing about how Evil Morty handles the symbolic dimensions of his presidency. The election of a Morty president was a historic event. It meant something to the Morty population of the Citadel, not just tactically, not just as a political outcome, emotionally, culturally, symbolically. A Morty had reached the highest office. For a population that had never had political representation, that had existed as a dependent class within a Rick-governed institution, that had been treated as equipment by the system they lived inside, the Morty presidency was, in some real sense, proof that the structure wasn't fixed, that change was possible, that representation was achievable. Evil Morty inherited all of that symbolic weight. He carries it as president. People project onto him everything they hope the Morty presidency would mean, and he lets them project. He doesn't correct the projection. He doesn't disabuse the Morty population of their hope in him, because the hope is useful. It keeps the political environment stable. It keeps potential dissent from organizing
organizing. It provides cover for the administration's actual activities. He used their hope to win the election. He continues to use their hope to maintain his position. The exploitation of a community's genuine aspirations is one of the more morally uncomfortable things the show presents about him, because it's not explosive or dramatic. It's quiet and sustained, and it operates on people who never did anything to deserve it. The question of whether Evil Morty is aware of and troubled by this dimension of his plan is one the show doesn't answer. He doesn't show us his interior life in a way that would reveal whether he carries guilt about the Morty population's misplaced trust. The controlled, calm exterior he presents throughout his appearances doesn't crack in the direction of regret. What we can say is that the show doesn't structure his story in a way that requires him to feel guilt. His plan is not organized around personal feelings about the people affected by it. It's organized around the objective, escape, and the steps required to reach it. The people who get hurt along the way, or who get left behind, or who are used without their knowledge are treated by Evil Morty as variables in a structural equation. The equation doesn't include their feelings, it includes their function. This is the most Rick-like thing about Evil Morty. Not the genius. He's not a scientific genius in Rick's sense, but the willingness to treat other people's lives as inputs to a calculation. The capacity to see human suffering as a data point rather than an obligation. The emotional distance from the people you affect that allows you to keep planning past them. The show is aware of the irony. A Morty who was formed in a system that treated Mortys as inputs to a calculation is operating in his presidency by treating other Mortys as inputs to a calculation. He internalized something. Whether he'd recognize that and what he'd make of it is a question the show leaves closed. Season 4 comes and goes without Evil Morty appearing on screen. The Citadel exists off-screen with him running it. Whatever he's preparing it outside the frame of the show's narrative. This is one of the more remarkable aspects of how the show handles his character. He's the most powerful figure in the show's institutional world, the sitting president of the Citadel, and the show doesn't show him. It trusts you to hold the knowledge of what he is and what he's doing, to imagine the off-screen work of his presidency, and then to arrive at Season 5 ready for the operation to reach its execution phase. The absence is itself a form of characterization. Evil Morty doesn't need to be shown doing things. The show has established enough about how he operates that you can infer the off-screen presidency, the patient gathering of intelligence, the careful management of access, the slow accumulation of everything required for the plan's final phase. The absence from the screen is consistent with the presence of someone who does their most important work where no one is watching. When Season 5, Episode 10 opens, he's ready. The presidency gives Evil Morty something that no other position in the Citadel could have given him: authorization. The president of the Citadel can request information, direct resources, initiate security reviews, and access records that would be unavailable to any other entity within the institution. The presidency doesn't mean you run everything. The administrative machinery has inertia that predates any particular president, but it means you can direct attention and resources toward whatever you want to look at and have that direction received as legitimate institutional action rather than suspicious, anomalous behavior. For someone who has been running a covert intelligence operation for years, this is transformative. The intelligence work that Evil Morty needed to do to build toward the Curve's destruction required access to records, to technical systems, to Citadel infrastructure that he couldn't have touched from outside the institution. As president, he can authorize himself. He can direct the institution's own information apparatus to gather the information he needs, document it, and file it in ways that serve his purposes. The specific intelligence target, Rick C-137's memories, including his buried memories of his origin, would have required either direct neurological access to C-137, which is operationally complex and risky, or access to the Citadel's surveillance archives, which, as president, he could authorize himself to review. The show doesn't specify the mechanism, but the presidency makes the covert collection of C-137's memories a plausible administrative operation rather than an extraordinary one. There's also the question of what Evil Morty did with the Council of Ricks after his election. The Council was the actual governing body of the Citadel. The presidents before Evil Morty were, presumably, largely figureheads or compromise figures that the Council could work with. Evil Morty is not that. He's using the presidency as a vehicle for something the Council didn't anticipate and can't easily contain once it becomes visible. The show implies that Evil Morty systematically dismantled the Council's power, not through a dramatic confrontation, but through the quieter methods of someone who understands how institutions accumulate and distribute authority. Information is power in a bureaucratic environment. Who has access to what, who can authorize what, where the decision nodes are, these are the levers of institutional control. A president who understands how those levers work can redirect them, slowly, without triggering the kind of visible conflict that would generate organized resistance. By the time the finale of Season 5 arrives, and Evil Morty makes his move, the Citadel's ability to respond as an institution has been significantly compromised. The council that would have organized opposition is weakened. The security infrastructure that would have identified and neutralized a threat has been pointed elsewhere, or its records have been altered, or its key personnel have been moved into positions where they can't act coherently. None of this is shown in real time. All of it is implied by the ease with which the finale proceeds. The aspect of Evil Morty's presidency that's hardest to hold on to, because the show doesn't dramatize it, is the daily reality of it. He went to meetings. He made decisions that affected real people in the Citadel. He had staff. He gave speeches. He was, on the surface of things, a functioning president doing the ordinary work of the job, while below the surface, the entire apparatus of the presidency was being redirected toward the objective he'd been working toward since before Season 1. This double existence, the visible president and the invisible operator, is the most extreme version of something Evil Morty has been doing his entire arc. He has always been two things at once, what people see and what he's actually doing. The eye patch was a physical version of it in Season 1, visible camouflage on top of invisible operation. The campaign was a rhetorical version of it, sincere-sounding appeals to democratic hope on top of an operation designed to use democratic hope as a vehicle. The presidency is the institutional version. He held real power over real people, made decisions that affected their lives, and used the legitimacy that power provided as cover for the operation that would eventually consume the institution itself. The people who worked under him, who briefed him, who carried out his directives, they were working for the most powerful office in the Citadel and simultaneously serving as instruments of its destruction. They didn't know it, he did. That sustained deception, across what the show implies was at least a year of presidential activity, requires a psychological capacity for compartmentalization and sustained purpose that is itself remarkable. Whatever Evil Morty's emotional life looks like beneath the opacity the show gives him, it includes the ability to perform normality at the highest levels of institutional visibility for years while pursuing an objective that would make all of it irrelevant. One final element of the President Morty section worth noting, the show's deliberate refusal to let Evil Morty become a symbol of Morty empowerment. The Morty population voted for him because he represented the possibility that things could change, that the Citadel's hierarchy of Rick dominance could be challenged by someone who had grown up inside it. That hope was real. The people who voted for him had real grievances and real aspirations. Evil Morty used those aspirations as fuel. He didn't share them, or if he did, his response to them was not to try to reform the institution from within, which the episode's 3 storylines had already established was impossible. His response was to dismantle it entirely. Whether the Morty voters who elected him would have consented to that objective if he'd explained it honestly is a question the show doesn't answer. But the gap between what they thought they were voting for and what they were actually enabling is one of the quietly devastating implications of his arc. He gave them hope and used the hope as a mechanism. He was, in this sense, doing to the Morty voter base exactly what the system had always done to Mortys, treating them as a resource in service of an objective they hadn't consented to and hadn't been asked about. Whether he recognized this parallel and whether it troubled him, the show doesn't say. The specific way Evil Morty handled the transition of power in the Citadel from the Council's operative control to something more aligned with his own agenda is worth thinking through in detail, because it reveals the kind of institutional understanding that made his plan viable. Political transitions inside entrenched institutions are almost never clean. The new leadership inherits not just the formal powers of the office, but the informal power structures, the established loyalties, the bureaucratic inertia of personnel who served the previous regime and will continue to serve the new one primarily in the ways they always have. A new president who wants to meaningfully redirect an institution like the Citadel would face the accumulated resistance of every administrator, security official, and institutional officer who benefited from the old arrangement and has no particular incentive to help the new arrangement succeed. Evil Morty's response to this, as the show implies, was not to try to reform the institutional personnel. It was to not need them reformed. He didn't need the Citadel's bureaucracy to be loyal to his
agenda, he needed it to not obstruct his intelligence gathering and his operational preparation. Those are different requirements. Obstruction requires active decision-making by personnel who perceive a threat. He moved carefully enough, made his requests through channels legitimate enough that the bureaucracy processed his needs without perceiving a threat worth mobilizing against. The presidency gave him enough authority that his access requests were processed as ordinary administrative activity. He didn't have to hack the archives or break into the technical systems. He asked for access as the president, and the access was granted. The cover story of legitimate governance was functionally perfect because it was genuine governance. He was doing the job, at least in the visible ways, while using the job's authority for the invisible ones. The emotional architecture of his presidency, what it would feel like, subjectively, to hold the Citadel's highest office while planning to destroy it, is one of the more interesting unexplored territories in the show's mythology. The show doesn't go there, consistent with its policy of not giving Evil Morty an interior life the viewer can access directly. But the situation itself implies certain things. He spent at least a year, probably more, as the functioning president of an institution he intended to use as fuel for its own destruction. He gave speeches, he held meetings, he made decisions that affected the lives of the Citadel's population. He probably gave orders that served the nominal good of the institution, because a president who is visibly neglecting or harming the institution would attract the kind of scrutiny he needed to avoid. That means doing the job, actually governing, making decisions about resource allocation, about policy, about the 10,000 small questions that institutional management involves, while knowing that all of it would eventually be irrelevant, that the institution would cease to exist, that every operational decision he made in the exercise of the presidency was, in the longest possible view, inconsequential. Most people can't sustain that kind of dual consciousness without it showing somewhere. The effort of maintaining the performance of ordinary institutional engagement while carrying the knowledge of what you're actually doing tends to leave traces. Evil Morty, apparently, didn't leave traces that anyone detected. Whether that reflects a genuine compartmentalization capacity or an authentic indifference to outcomes that made the governance work feel as meaningless as it ultimately was, or something else, the show doesn't say. The opacity is total. One thread that never fully resolves in the show's depiction of the presidency is the question of whether any Citadel citizens genuinely benefited from Evil Morty's time in office. The election was won on a platform of reform. The Morty population voted for a candidate who promised to address their grievances. Did anything change for them in the period between the election and the finale? The show doesn't give us a clear picture of day-to-day life in the Citadel during Evil Morty's presidency. We don't see whether his administration did or didn't implement anything that materially improved conditions for Mortys. What we know is that by the time the finale arrives, the Citadel is still the Citadel. The structural arrangements that define Morty life in the Ricklantis Mixup haven't been transformed. This ambiguity is characteristic of how the show treats institutional change, as something that requires more than a change in leadership to produce, and that may require the dismantling of the institution itself before genuine transformation is possible. The election raised hopes. The presidency may have produced some incremental shifts, but the structure persisted until it was burned. Section 6. The Hidden Problems of the Citadel. Evil Morty's plan, when it executes in Season 5, is not random destruction. It's not a tantrum. It's targeted, deliberate, aimed at the specific structural element, the Central Finite Curve, that he has identified as the foundational injustice of the Rick-organized multiverse. To understand the targeting, you have to understand the structure being targeted. This section goes deeper into the Citadel's actual functioning, the specific mechanisms of exploitation that the show reveals across its run. Not the high-level institutional picture we covered in Section 3, but the lived texture, the things that actually happen to people inside this system. The examples the show uses to demonstrate what the Citadel is. Start with the Simple Ricks operation, because it's the most concentrated example of how the Citadel monetizes the exploitation of individuals. Simple Rick, as revealed in the Ricklantis Mixup, is a Rick who chose happiness over achievement. He abandoned the multiverse-spanning genius life for a quiet family existence, and found in that small life a genuine contentment that most Ricks can't access, not because it's beyond their capability, but because the drive that makes Ricks geniuses is also the drive that makes peace inaccessible to them. Simple Rick found peace, and the Citadel, encountering a Rick who had something it couldn't replicate through its normal
operations, decided to extract it. He is held in a machine. The machine keeps him in a medically maintained state that preserves his access to the specific memories and emotional experiences that constitute his happiness. The Citadel's technology reads that emotional state and processes the output into the wafer cookies. The product is literally made from his inner experience. This is not exceptional within the Citadel's operating logic. It's the same logic applied everywhere in the institution. The logic that treats whatever a being produces, whether biological, intellectual, or emotional, as a resource to be harvested if there's value in the harvest. Simple Rick's happiness has commercial value. Therefore, it's harvested. The question of whether Simple Rick has standing to object to this arrangement is not one the Citadel has built a mechanism for asking. The Mortys who work in the factory producing Simple Rick's cookies are doing labor in a system they may not fully understand. The Morty thread in the Ricklantis Mixup follows one factory worker's discovery of what the operation actually involves. His reaction, the collision between his working understanding of his job and the reality underneath it, is the episode dramatizing something that must happen at some level to everyone who looks closely enough at any of the Citadel's operations. The factory is just an honest version of the logic that runs everything. The labor economy of the Citadel is worth examining in its own right, separate from the Simple Rick example. The Citadel is a functioning economy. It has businesses, services, manufacturing, distribution, retail. Ricks run most of the significant enterprises. They have the genius, the resources, and the institutional standing to own and operate businesses. But businesses require workers, and the Citadel's working class is substantially composed of Mortys. The Ricklantis Mixup shows us this directly. Mortys in service jobs, Mortys in manufacturing, Mortys doing the labor that keeps the Citadel's economy running, while Ricks hold the positions of ownership, management, and professional authority. The class structure is visible in who's behind the counter and who's sitting down to be served. This is not incidental. The class structure of the Citadel is a direct consequence of the founding logic of the institution. Ricks built the Citadel for Ricks. The distribution of resources and opportunity within it reflects that origin. Ricks have capital. Ricks have institutional standing. Ricks have access to the kinds of knowledge and technology that translate into economic power. Mortys arrived in the institution as dependents, necessary for the brainwave function, not holders of capital or institutional standing, and the economic hierarchy that formed from those starting conditions placed Mortys consistently below Ricks. Because the hierarchy formed from structural starting conditions, rather than from explicitly malicious policy, it has the quality of naturalness that makes structural inequality so persistent. It doesn't feel like oppression to most of the people inside it. It feels like how things are. Ricks run things because Ricks are geniuses. Mortys work in factories because that's the kind of work available to them. The system produces the outcome without needing a villain who set out to design it this way. The education system's role in reproducing this hierarchy is something worth spending time on, because education is often the place where structural inequalities either get reproduced or get challenged, and the Citadel's educational apparatus is clearly designed for the former. Mortys attend school. The school teaches them things. Some of those things are genuinely useful. Practical knowledge, skills, information about navigating the Citadel's environment. But the curriculum is designed and delivered by Ricks, and it operates within a frame that the Citadel's hierarchy has determined is appropriate for Mortys. What that frame excludes is significant. It excludes the tools for critical analysis of the Citadel's structure. It excludes the history of the Morty population within the Citadel in terms that would allow Mortys to identify and name their exploitation. It excludes the kind of structural thinking that would allow a student to look at the assignment system, the labor economy, the governance structure, and see them as connected parts of a design that serves Rick interests at Morty expense. You can't produce that kind of thinking through a curriculum controlled by the people who benefit from the current arrangement. Not because every individual Rick running the schools is consciously trying to prevent it. Most of them probably aren't. But because the content that challenges the hierarchy is exactly the content that an institution designed to serve the hierarchy would have no reason to include. It gets left out by default, by the logic of who gets to decide what matters. The result is that Mortys emerge from the Citadel's educational system prepared to participate in a world as it already is, rather than equipped to think about whether it should be different. Most of them don't have the analytical framework that Evil Morty clearly has. Not because they're less capable than him, the show doesn't suggest that, because they were educated created within the system rather than outside it. The Morty's Mind Blowers episode from Season 3, not a Citadel episode directly, but relevant to this section, adds a dimension to the picture of what Morty's life actually looks like inside the Rick/Morty dynamic. Rick C137, it's revealed in this episode, has been removing Morty's memories, selectively, extracting specific moments, traumatic ones that reflect badly on Rick, ones that Morty would have trouble processing, and storing them in a collection of vials that Rick controls. The memories aren't destroyed, they're preserved in a way, but they're no longer accessible to Morty. He doesn't know they exist. He carries the gaps they leave without knowing he has gaps, because the process that created the gaps also removed the knowledge that there was something to remember. This is Rick C137 specifically, not a Citadel policy. It's a personal behavior driven by whatever combination of protectiveness and self-interest Rick uses to justify it to himself. But it illustrates a dynamic that the Citadel runs on at scale. Mortys don't fully control their own histories. The people who are supposed to be caring for them are making decisions about what they're allowed to know. The Guardian and the Controller are the same entity. At the Citadel level, this manifests as the institutional management of Morty information. Mortys don't have access to their own assignment records in a way that would allow them to evaluate patterns in their treatment. Mortys don't have access to the research the Citadel has conducted about the brainwave dampening effect and what it costs them. Mortys don't have access to the political history of decisions that shape the Citadel's treatment of their population. They have what they've been given, which is not the same thing as what there is to know. The adventures themselves, the expeditions that constitute the central activity of the Rick/Morty dynamic, are a site of specific, ongoing physical and psychological harm to Mortys that the Citadel has no mechanism for addressing. Morty's life with Rick C137 involves consistent exposure to danger, consistent psychological pressure, consistent encounters with mortality, both simulated and real, and consistent experience of being in situations that would traumatize anyone, managed by a genius who has, to put it gently, a limited interest in Morty's emotional processing needs. The show tracks this harm across its run. It's part of the show's texture, the gap between Rick's capacity to cope with the multiverse and Morty's much more ordinary human frailty, and it never suggests that the harm is unusual among Rick/Morty pairings. Ricks do dangerous things. Mortys come along because their presence is necessary. Mortys get hurt. Some of that hurt is physical, some psychological, some more subtle. The slow erosion of a young person's sense of reality that comes from spending years in a universe where the rules are whatever the smartest person in the room says they are. It accumulates. The Citadel doesn't track it. The Citadel has no mechanism for acknowledging that the expeditions harm their Mortys, because acknowledging that would imply an obligation to do something about it, and the institution has no interest in acquiring that obligation. The social exclusion of Mortys from Citadel governance is not incidental, it's structural, and structures don't change because someone asks nicely. The Council of Ricks never included Morty representation, not a single Morty seat on the governing body, not a Morty advisory role, not a consultative mechanism that would allow the Morty population's perspective to inform decisions that affected them. The governance of the Citadel was pure Rick, from top to bottom, entirely composed of the population the institution was designed to serve. The introduction of democracy in Season 3 was an attempt to change this in a formal sense, but formal change without substantive change in the distribution of power, resources, and information produces an election system that the existing hierarchy can use rather than challenge. The Morty candidates who ran in the Season 3 election were running in a system where the resources, the institutional connections, and the information advantages were all on the Rick side. A Morty who won that election would be entering an institution built for Ricks, staffed by Ricks, designed for Rick purposes, with a formal title and a legitimacy problem that the title alone couldn't resolve. Evil Morty won that election and proceeded to demonstrate this reality. A Morty president in a Rick institution is still in a Rick institution. The title doesn't change the architecture. What does this accumulation of harm and exclusion and exploitation produce in the people who live inside it? Most Mortys inside the Citadel don't have the analysis or the resources to do what Evil Morty did. Most of them are managing their situations as best they can within the constraints available to them. They build community where they can. They find meaning where they can. They carry their damage as best they can. The Ricklantis Mixup shows you several versions of this. Different Mortys in different situations, all navigating the same fundamental environment with different strategies and different outcomes. None of those strategies produce the outcome Evil Morty produced. They're internal adjustments to an external structure. They make life within the structure more bearable. They don't change the structure. Evil Morty looked at the structure, saw it as a structure, saw it as something designed by specific choices for specific purposes that could be different, that was not natural and inevitable, but constructed and therefore potentially destructible, and decided that internal adjustment was not worth the energy. The structure was the problem. The structure was what had to go. Whether he was right about that, whether the Citadel was genuinely irreformable, whether internal change was truly impossible, the show doesn't definitively answer, but the evidence the show provides about the depth and pervasiveness of the structural injustice is substantial. The argument that this particular machine couldn't be reformed from within is not a fringe position. It's a reasonable conclusion from the available evidence. Evil Morty reached that conclusion. He acted on it. The next two sections are about what he built to act on it and what he did with it when he was ready. The Mind Blowers episode from Season 3, which focuses on Rick's practice of selectively erasing memories from Morty, connects to the hidden problems of the Citadel in a way that's easy to miss if you're watching it as a standalone comedy episode. The episode's premise is that Rick has been editing Morty's memory for years, removing the experiences that were too traumatic or too complicated or too inconvenient for whatever reason. The device used is called a mind blower, and the episode frames this as Rick managing a relationship, keeping things functional by removing the parts that would break it. What the episode implies, underneath the comedy, is that the adventure life is producing so much trauma that a memory editing device has become a regular tool of relationship maintenance. Morty has been through enough experiences that his full, unedited memory would be unmanageable. The mind blower isn't a one-time emergency measure, it's regular maintenance. Rick uses it periodically. The removed memories have accumulated into a substantial archive. This connects to the broader question of what adventures actually do to Mortys over time. The Citadel had to have dealt with this at an institutional scale. Thousands of Mortys across infinite dimensions, accompanying thousands of Ricks on dangerous missions across the multiverse. The adventure damage accumulates, the trauma compounds, and the institution's response to Mortys who are too damaged to continue, Mortys who can't perform the dampening function anymore because their psychological state has deteriorated past the point of functional anxiety into something more severe, is something the show implies without showing directly. Evil Morty would have known about this. As someone who spent years inside the Citadel's world, as president with access to its records, he would have seen the actual data on adventure death rates, on psychological attrition, on the processing of Mortys who couldn't continue. The systematic nature of the damage wasn't visible to any individual Morty living it. It was visible at the institutional scale, and Evil Morty had access to the institutional scale. The corruption within the Citadel is depicted most vividly in the cop storyline of the Ricklantis Mixup, but it's not the only example the show provides. The systemic corruption is visible in the gap between what the institution claims to be and what it actually does. The Citadel presents itself as a community, a collective of Ricks who recognize the value of shared infrastructure and mutual cooperation. The governance framework, the Council of Ricks, presents itself as a legitimate representative body, making decisions on behalf of the Rick community. The education system for Mortys presents itself as preparation and support. The assignment system presents itself as matching. What these systems actually do, as the show depicts them, is different from what they claim to do. The community is a hierarchy. The council is a self-perpetuating oligarchy that represents the interests of the Ricks who have been in the institution long enough to accumulate influence. The education prepares Mortys for roles the institution has already decided they'll fill. The assignment matches Mortys to Ricks in ways that maximize institutional utility, not individual compatibility. The corruption isn't dramatic individual misconduct. It's the gap between the institution's stated values and its actual operations, built into the structure and reproduced by every component of the system. You can replace every individual Rick on the council, every administrator in the assignment office, every teacher in the Morty school, and as long as the structural incentives and assumptions remain in place, the institution will produce the same outcomes. The corruption is in the design. The adventure mortality problem deserves its own attention because the show references it in ways that are easy to pass over but that accumulate into a significant indictment. Mortys die on adventures. This is stated multiple times, treated as background fact, and demonstrated in various episodes. The mortality isn't accidental or exceptional, it's structural. Adventures are dangerous. Mortys go on them because they accompany Ricks. Ricks. Ricks are willing to take Mortys into dangerous situations because the Morty's function, brainwave dampening, is necessary, and because the loss of a Morty is, within the Citadel's logic, a manageable institutional cost rather than a human tragedy. There are Mortys who died on adventures that were completely avoidable, adventures that Rick chose to take, or that the Citadel directed, or that could have been handled without bringing a Morty along, but brought one anyway because that's the established operating procedure. The dampening requirement isn't always actually operative in every situation, but the habit of having the Morty present has calcified into practice regardless of operational necessity. Evil Morty didn't lose his life on an adventure. Whatever happened to him, he survived. But the system that produces adventure mortality is the same system that produced him. The thousands of Mortys who didn't survive are, in a sense, the background against which his survival and his eventual action should be understood. He's the Morty who made it through the system and then turned around and dismantled it. Most Mortys didn't make it far enough to have that option. The hidden problems of the Citadel converge on one central argument that the show builds toward through accumulation rather than statement. The Citadel's problems are not correctable problems. They're not aberrations. They're not the result of particular bad actors who could be removed or particular policies that could be reformed. They're features of the system's fundamental design. This is the distinction that matters most for understanding why Evil Morty doesn't try to reform the institution. Reform is the rational response to a system with correctable problems. Identify what's wrong, find the fix, implement it, measure the improvement. Reform doesn't require destroying. Reform requires only adjustment. But the Citadel's problems aren't correctable because the problems are the system. The labor exploitation isn't a policy that could be changed while keeping everything else. It's what the institution was built to do. The Morty assignment system isn't a bureaucratic inefficiency that better management could address. It's the central function the institution exists to perform. The adventure mortality isn't an unfortunate side effect of something else. It's the direct cost of the Rick/Morty operational model that defines the institution's entire purpose. To fix these problems, you would have to stop doing the things the institution was built to do. And an institution that has stopped doing the things it was built to do isn't an institution anymore. It's a different institution, built on different premises, serving different purposes. The Citadel could be replaced. It couldn't be reformed into something fundamentally different while remaining the Citadel. Evil Morty understood this. His plan was never reform. His plan was replacement, and his method of replacement was destruction of the structure that prevented the replacement from happening. The curve had to go before any genuinely different institutional arrangement was possible, because the curve guaranteed the conditions that made the Citadel's particular arrangement seem natural and inevitable. The Morty culture that developed inside the Citadel, the folk religion around the one true Morty, the political consciousness that manifested in the election, the informal social bonds between Mortys who shared similar circumstances, is an interesting detail the show builds in to complicate the picture of Mortys as pure victims of the system. Mortys inside the Citadel were not passive. They organized. They had hopes. They had a collective identity that existed in relationship to their subordinate position within the institution, but wasn't entirely defined by it. The one true Morty mythology is probably the clearest example, a religious narrative of redemption and liberation that grew up specifically within the context of institutional subordination. It's the kind of mythology that emerges when a community needs to imagine a different future and doesn't have access to the institutional tools to create one. That the mythology was apparently available to be exploited. That the one true Morty candidate in the Ricklantis Mixup was either a fraud or easily co-opted, and that the workers who believed in him were used against their own interests, is a demonstration of how the system absorbs and neutralizes the internal resistance that its own conditions produce. The Morty community's aspirations become the tool of their own continued management. Evil Morty is not the one true Morty figure in any obvious sense. He doesn't claim that role, doesn't appeal to Morty religious consciousness, doesn't present himself as a liberator of the Morty community. He's something outside the categories the Morty community had available. Not a leader, not a prophet, not a reformer, but an agent with a specific objective that he pursues without framing it in terms the community could recognize and rally around. Whether the Morty community's liberation was a goal for him, or whether it was simply a consequence
consequence he was indifferent to, or whether the concept of collective liberation was simply outside the framework of what he was trying to accomplish, the show doesn't answer. He leaves. The Morty community, whatever it is after the Citadel's destruction, is left to figure out the aftermath without him. The accumulation of hidden problems, adventure mortality, labor exploitation, educational reproduction of hierarchy, the simple Rick factory, the assignment bureaucracy, the institutional corruption, is what makes the Citadel's eventual destruction feel, on a narrative level, like something that had already been decided. The show spent 2 seasons building a detailed picture of an institution that didn't work for most of the people inside it. By the time Evil Morty acts, the viewer has enough context to understand that the institution he's destroying wasn't functioning as advertised for a very long time. The hidden problems aren't really hidden, they're just not addressed. The difference between hidden and unaddressed is important. Hidden suggests secrecy, active concealment. Unaddressed suggests visibility that produces no response. The Citadel's problems were visible to everyone who lived inside them. The factory Mortys knew what the factory was. The cop Ricks knew what the districts looked like. The workers knew what happened to the one true Morty candidate. What was invisible was the aggregate, the single data point. One Morty's experience, one Rick's night shift, didn't reveal the pattern. The pattern was only visible at the institutional scale, and the institutional scale was where Evil Morty was operating. Section 7. The Central Finite Curve. The Central Finite Curve is the deepest concept in Evil Morty's story. It's introduced as a term in Season 5, Episode 10, but it explains something that has been structurally true about the show's multiverse from the beginning. It's the piece of the picture that, when revealed, makes everything else about the Rick-organized cosmos click into place. And it's the specific thing that Evil Morty spent his entire arc building toward destroying. Understanding the curve fully is the prerequisite for understanding the Season 5 finale. Let's work through it. The multiverse in Rick and Morty is infinite. This is a foundational premise of the show. Infinite dimensions, infinite possibilities, infinite parallel realities. Every version of every event exists somewhere. Every conceivable configuration of the universe is real in some dimension. Infinity is the actual literal size of the multiverse. Within that infinite multiverse, the show has given us a sense of the accessible portion, the dimensions that Rick visits, that the Citadel operates within, that the show's adventures take place across. That portion is large. There are countless dimensions in it. The multiverse of the show feels enormous, borderless, inexhaustible. But the Season 5 finale reveals that this is not the whole multiverse. The portion of the multiverse that Ricks operate within, that the Citadel governs, that Rick and Morty travel through, that portion has a boundary, a wall, a constructed limit beyond which the show's characters have never gone, because no one they know has ever tried to. That wall is the Central Finite Curve. The curve, as Evil Morty explains it, is a boundary drawn around a specific subset of the infinite multiverse. That subset is defined by one criterion. In every dimension within the curve, Rick is the smartest being in existence. This is the selection principle. Not dimensions where humans exist, not dimensions where Earth is recognizable, dimensions where Rick's particular form of genius is the apex of intelligence. Every dimension inside the curve is one where Rick sits at the top of the intelligence hierarchy. Every dimension outside the curve, the infinite remainder of the infinite multiverse, is one where that isn't necessarily true, where something else might be smarter, where Rick's genius, impressive by the standards of his dimension, isn't the defining quality of the most capable entities around. The curve was constructed. This is the key point Evil Morty makes, and it's the point that lands hardest. The boundary didn't form naturally. It wasn't a discovered feature of multiversal geography. Someone built it. A group of Ricks, at some point in the history of the Rick community, made a decision. We will bound our accessible multiverse by the parameter of our own supremacy. We will draw a wall around the portion of reality where we're always the best, and we will operate only within that wall. This is, to put it plainly, an enormous act of vanity, or an enormous act of self-protective insecurity, or both. The curve exists because Ricks wanted to live in a universe where they were always the smartest. They wanted that enough to build the architecture that would guarantee it, and having built it, they continue to build the Citadel and their entire civilization within it, organized around the premise that Rick's supremacy was a fact of the universe rather than an artifact of their own construction. The implications of this revelation spread in every direction. The Citadel's
foundational claim, the basis of its authority, the justification for its hierarchy, the premise underlying the Rick/Morty dynamic, and everything that flows from it is that Ricks are the smartest. This is presented within the Citadel's logic as a fact of nature. Ricks are geniuses, Mortys are not. The hierarchy that follows from that natural fact, Ricks at the top, Mortys as the tools, is the natural order of things. But if the curve exists, then the fact of nature is a manufactured condition. The Citadel's hierarchy is built on a tautology. Ricks are the smartest within the multiverse, which was designed to ensure Ricks are always the smartest. The justification for the hierarchy is the thing the hierarchy built to justify itself. It's circular all the way down. This doesn't mean Rick isn't smart. He clearly is. His genius is genuine within the bounds of what he can access. But genius operating within a curated sample of reality is not the same thing as supreme intelligence in the full, infinite multiverse. The curve made the first thing look like the second thing, and everyone inside the curve, including the Ricks who benefit from the deception, has been operating inside that tautology. Evil Morty's articulation of this in the season 5 finale is one of the most important pieces of dialogue in the show's run. He doesn't deliver it dramatically, he doesn't shout it, he says it calmly, almost conversationally, in the way you'd explain something to someone who should already understand it but needs to hear it said out loud. The Central Finite Curve is a cage designed specifically to keep Rick feeling supreme. The Citadel is the civilization built inside that cage. The Rick/Morty dynamic is one of the social structures that cage civilization produced. And the status of Mortys within that civilization, as tools, as camouflage, as equipment, is a feature of the cage's design, not a fact of the universe. Outside the cage, none of that necessarily holds. Outside the curve, there are universes where Rick's genius doesn't dominate, where the hierarchy doesn't exist in the same form, where a Morty isn't categorically a tool, where the word Morty might not mean anything at all. Evil Morty wants to go to those universes, not to improve them, not to bring the Rick civilization's values into the uncurated multiverse, just to be somewhere the cage doesn't apply to him. The question of who built the curve and Rick C-137's specific connection to that construction is one of the season 5 finale's most significant reveals. The show is careful here. It doesn't say that C-137 alone built the curve. The construction of something this architecturally significant would presumably require more than one Rick. What the show establishes is that C-137 was involved, that his history intersects with the curve's construction in a way that makes him the key to understanding how it could be undone. C-137's involvement is connected to his personal history, the loss that shaped him, the choices he made in the aftermath of that loss, the path that took him into deep involvement with the Rick community's infrastructure. The specifics of that connection are explored in the season 5 finale through the memories Evil Morty has gathered. What they show is not simply an abstract technical contribution. They show a younger C-137 making decisions that had structural consequences he may not have fully anticipated in the context of grief and revenge and the kind of choices people make when they're not thinking past the immediate horizon. The curve was built by Ricks who wanted to secure their position. C-137 participated in that construction, and now, decades later, the Morty he's been in the vicinity of, not his own Morty, but a Morty who has been watching and studying and planning, has figured out that the construction contains the seed of its own destruction, and that C-137 holds the specific key. What does breaking the curve actually require? The show doesn't provide a technical manual. It shows the result, the curve failing, the boundary dissolving, the golden light of the infinite multiverse flooding through, but it doesn't detail the mechanism in engineering terms. What it does establish is that the breaking requires specific information about the curve's construction, combined with the energy and apparatus that Evil Morty has been positioning during his presidency. The Citadel itself serves as the energy source. This is an elegant and horrible detail. The most powerful single structure in the bounded multiverse, the institution built specifically to protect and extend the logic of the curve, is the fuel for the curve's destruction. Evil Morty spent 2 years governing the Citadel in order to position it perfectly to be dismantled in service of the curve's collapse. He was not managing the institution, he was loading the gun. The specific mechanism of how C-137's memories or knowledge translate into the technical capability to break the curve is presented more through effect than explanation. What matters for the story is that the connection exists, that Evil Morty understood it and spent years working toward it, and that when the moment came, it worked. There's a philosophical dimension to the curve that the show invites you to sit with. If the curve is a cage, If the portion of the multiverse available to Ricks is a curated subset selected for Rick's supremacy, then everything that has ever happened within the show takes place inside a construction. The adventures, the philosophizing, the discoveries, the grief, the relationships, all of it is happening inside a reality that was shaped by a choice someone made to ensure that a particular kind of being was always at the top. This doesn't invalidate any of it. The things that happened to Rick, C-137, and Morty were real within the reality available to them. The feelings were real. The consequences were real. But the frame, the assumption that Rick's genius was a fact of the universe rather than a consequence of the universe's curation, that assumption was wrong. The show spent 4 seasons before revealing this, letting you share that wrong assumption so that when the reveal comes, it lands with the weight of something you didn't know you'd been missing. The Curve is the show telling you that everything you've watched has taken place inside a box you didn't know was there, and the character who found the door in the box is walking through it at the end of season 5. Not with triumph, with the quiet purpose of someone who has finally gotten where they were going after a very long time on the road. The season 4 gap, Evil Morty's absence from the screen across an entire season while he held the Citadel's highest office, is worth thinking about carefully. What does a being with Evil Morty's intelligence and objectives do with a year as president of the most powerful institution in the multiverse? The show doesn't show us this period directly, but it gives us enough context to understand what the presidency would have given him access to: intelligence archives, security infrastructure, personnel records on every Rick affiliated with the Citadel, including the most sensitive operational data about their activities, their locations, their vulnerabilities, the ability to direct resources, the ability to authorize investigations that others wouldn't question because the orders are coming from the elected leader. The presidency is not power in the visible governance sense that most political leaders pursue. The Citadel's actual functioning, its day-to-day operations, its resource allocation, its relationships with external entities had been managed by the Council of Ricks for generations before Evil Morty arrived. A new president doesn't simply reshape all of that on day one, but a new president does have access, and access for someone who has been building an operation from the outside for years is transformative. Evil Morty spent the time between his election and Rickmurai Jack building the intelligence picture he needed to take the final step. The memories he gathered from Rick C-137, the technical schematics and resource requirements for destroying the Central Finite Curve, the identification and neutralization of the threats within the Citadel that would try to stop him when he moved. None of that is visible in the episodes. All of it is implied by the capability he demonstrates when he finally acts. The Simple Rick's wafer cookie operation from the Ricklantis Mixup, seen briefly as a factory storyline in that episode, deserves more than the passing treatment it usually gets in discussions of the Citadel's social structure. It's one of the more disturbing things the show has shown us about what the institution is actually built on. Simple Rick is a Rick who found genuine happiness. He stepped out of the endless wheel of genius and adventure and discovered that what he actually wanted, what made him content, what his brain actually responded to with joy rather than restless dissatisfaction, was ordinary domestic life, his daughter, small moments, the feeling of being loved without being useful. He found peace, and the Citadel's response to this was to harvest his brain, to hook Simple Rick into a machine that extracts his contentment and uses it to flavor mass-produced cookies. His subjective experience of happiness is a product. It is literally consumed by other Ricks who buy the cookies as a brief escape from their own restlessness. Simple Rick's contentment is monetized. His peace is a commodity. The image is not subtle. The Citadel is a machine that takes whatever is genuinely good about life, connection, peace, contentment, the feeling of being wanted for something other than your utility, and turns it into a product to be sold back to the people who are too busy or too driven or too trapped in the system to experience those things authentically. It extracts the good, it packages it, it sells it, and the person the good came from exists in a state of permanent, managed harvesting. Evil Morty grew up in this world. He looked at Simple Rick and saw not just an individual horror, but a systemic one. The Citadel doesn't just use Mortys as camouflage, it uses uses Rick's best impulses as raw material. It uses every form of genuine human experience as a resource to be extracted and resold. It is, at its core, an extraction machine, and the people inside it are both the operators and the ore. The Central Finite Curve, when the show finally names and explains it in Rickmurai Jack, recontextualizes everything we've seen about the Citadel up to that point, but it also recontextualizes something that had seemed like a narrative convenience in earlier seasons: the question of why Rick is always the smartest. The show had presented Rick's genius as a given. He's the smartest man in the universe. This is stated and demonstrated repeatedly in the early seasons, but it never quite explained why the multiverse happens to be configured in a way that makes Rick dominant. Infinite universes should contain infinite configurations of intelligence. Some should be smarter than Rick. Some should have civilizations so far beyond Rick's level that he'd be irrelevant by comparison. The curve is the answer to that question. The curve is why Rick is always the smartest. Inside the portion of the multiverse it contains, it's not that Rick's genius is cosmically given, it's that the universe has been curated around Rick's genius. The accessible multiverse, the part that the show has been set in, is the part that was selected and bounded to guarantee a particular configuration of dominance. Rick is the smartest because the boundaries of the accessible multiverse were drawn to exclude the portions where he wouldn't be. This changes the meaning of the Citadel entirely. The Citadel is not just an institution that grew up around the Rick/Morty dynamic. It's an institution that exists within a cosmological structure that was designed to guarantee that structure's own continued relevance. The Citadel, with its Council of Ricks, its assignment system, its economy built on Morty utility, all of it only makes sense inside the curve. Inside the curve, Rick's supremacy is guaranteed. Outside it, nothing about the Citadel's hierarchy is cosmologically secured. Evil Morty understood this. He understood that the Citadel could not be reformed from within, not because the people in it were irredeemably bad, but because the Citadel existed within a cosmological arrangement that guaranteed the conditions of its own existence. You can't reform the institution without addressing the structure that makes the institution possible, and the structure is the curve. The tautological quality of the Central Finite Curve is one of the things that makes it philosophically interesting beyond its role as a plot device. The curve exists to guarantee that Rick is the smartest being in the accessible multiverse. But the question of why that guarantee needed to be built, why the multiverse needed to be curated around Rick's dominance rather than existing in its natural configuration, points back to the Ricks themselves. The curve was built. Someone built it. The show attributes its construction to Rick, or at least to a group of Ricks, though the specific history of its construction is not fully detailed in the episodes. What the show does make clear is that it required enormous intelligence and resource investment to build and maintain, and the purpose of that investment was to ensure a particular relationship between intelligence and power, specifically that the most intelligent beings in the accessible multiverse were Ricks, and that this intelligence guaranteed them a particular position in the cosmic hierarchy. The circularity here is deliberate and damning. Rick built the curve to prove Rick's supremacy. Rick's supremacy was then demonstrated within the curve. The demonstration of supremacy was then used to justify the curve's existence. You can't challenge the logic from inside it because the curve is the thing defining the terms of the challenge. Evil Morty's response to this circularity is elegantly simple. Don't try to refute the logic from inside it. Get outside it. The curve can't define what you are if you're not inside its boundaries. The hierarchy of intelligence it maintains has no authority over whatever exists beyond its edges. The curve's tautological self-justification only has force if you remain in the territory it claims. This is why Evil Morty's plan culminates in exit rather than in defeat of the system from within. He doesn't try to argue with the curve's internal logic, he breaks the boundary and walks through. The specific mechanism by which the curve was maintained across infinite dimensions is not fully explained by the show. The implication is that it required ongoing technical infrastructure, not just the initial construction, but continuous maintenance of the boundary. This infrastructure was presumably housed within or managed by the Citadel, since the Citadel is the natural institution for managing multiverse-scale shared infrastructure among Ricks. If that's correct, then the Citadel wasn't just an institution that existed inside the curve. The Citadel was part of the mechanism that maintained the curve. The Council of Ricks, in governing the Citadel, was, in effect, governing part of the apparatus that kept the cosmological structure intact. The most powerful institution in the accessible multiverse was simultaneously the most powerful institution in the accessible multiverse and the infrastructure support for the thing that guaranteed that configuration of power. This is what Evil Morty was using when he used the Citadel's energy to destroy the curve in Rickmurai Jack. He wasn't just destroying an institution, he was turning the maintenance infrastructure against the thing it maintained. He converted the power source of the curve's perpetuation into the energy for its termination. The elegance of this is worth pausing on. The thing that kept the curve intact was itself converted into the force that broke it. The experience of living inside the curve, for most of its inhabitants, was invisible. The curve isn't a visible wall. You can't see it. You can't feel it. From inside, it doesn't feel like a constructed limitation. It feels like reality. Rick is the smartest. That's how the universe is. The accessible multiverse is the multiverse. There's no reason to imagine there's more of it beyond some invisible boundary, and no apparent mechanism for imagining what that beyond might contain. For most Ricks, the curve probably never registered as a constructed thing at all. The genius that defined them, the dominance it enabled, the institutional structure that grew up to organize that dominance, all of it would have felt like natural order rather than designed consequence. This is the most insidious quality of structures that are built to guarantee their own apparent inevitability. The people inside them don't experience them as structures, they experience them as facts. Evil Morty was different. He experienced the curve as a structure, as a designed thing, with a purpose that served some people and constrained others, with walls that could, in principle, be breached. Whether he always understood this, or whether his understanding developed over time, the show doesn't say, but his response to the curve, the technical and operational work of destroying it, required understanding it as a constructed artifact rather than as natural law. You can't destroy what you perceive as simply real. You can only destroy what you recognize as built. The recognition is the prerequisite, and the recognition, for Evil Morty, seems to have come early enough that by the time he had the capability to act on it, he had already been living with the understanding for years. The relationship between the Central Finite Curve and the concept of free will inside it is one of the more unsettling implications the show raises without fully developing. Within the curve, certain outcomes are guaranteed. Rick is always the smartest. The configurations of power that flow from that guarantee are, within the curve's boundaries, inevitable. Individual beings make choices, but the frame within which those choices are made has been constructed to produce particular distributions of outcomes. In this sense, the lives lived inside the curve were lives lived inside a designed environment. Not designed in the sense that every individual outcome was predetermined, the characters genuinely make choices, and those choices matter within their contexts, but designed in the sense that the range of possible outcomes, the distribution of power and resource and opportunity, was shaped by the curve's maintenance in ways that made certain things much more likely and other things much less. Evil Morty understood this. His departure through the portal wasn't just a geographical exit, it was an exit from a designed context into an undesigned one, or at least a differently designed one where the guarantees the curve maintained no longer apply. What that means for the question of what's possible for him or for anyone is genuinely unknown, but the exit was also a refusal of the designed outcomes, a choice to operate in a context where the distribution of the possible hadn't been pre-shaped in ways that guaranteed his subordination. Section 8. Rickmurai Jack. Season 5, Episode 10. Rickmurai Jack, the season finale. Everything in Evil Morty's arc, every season of setup, every carefully placed appearance, every piece of intelligence gathered during the presidency, every step of the long, patient plan reaches its execution point in this episode. And the episode knows the weight it's carrying. It doesn't rush. It doesn't streamline. It takes its time, shows you what needs to be shown, and lets you sit with the consequences. This is the episode. Let's go through it. Rickmurai Jack has two structural halves that are intercut and then converge. The first half is about Rick C137, his history, the truth of his backstory, the memories that Evil Morty has gathered and is now presenting. The second half is about Evil Morty's plan in its execution phase. The two halves are connected by the specific way C137's history contains the key to the curve's destruction, and the episode works toward that connection through the slow, careful revelation of both sides. The episode begins with Rick C137 in a situation that has developed over Season 5's arc. Without going deeply into the Season 5 storylines that don't directly concern Evil Morty, they're worth their own exploration, but they're not part of this story. Rick is dealing with consequences of his choices. He's in a vulnerable position, one he
he's navigating with typical Rick C-137 stubbornness and complicated motivation. And then, Evil Morty's plan makes itself felt. The Citadel's operations, which have been building throughout the unseen presidency, begin to manifest in ways that Rick can't ignore. The episode draws Rick C-137 toward the Citadel, toward a confrontation with Evil Morty, toward the revelation that waits for him there. The sequence in which Evil Morty presents C-137 with his own history is one of the most carefully constructed in the series. The way the scene is set up, Evil Morty has clearly done extensive preparation. He has assembled, through the intelligence operation conducted during his presidency, a reconstruction of Rick C-137's actual history, not the various cover stories and deflections Rick has used over the years, not the fabricated origin he described in Season 3, but the actual events, the things that happened, the choices that were made. What the presentation reveals is this: Rick C-137 had a family before the events of the series, before his Morty, before the adventures, before the version of himself we know. He had a wife, a daughter who would become Beth, a life that was, by his standards, settled. He was a genius, living in a way that most Ricks don't, with genuine investment in people, with something to lose that wasn't an experiment or a resource. That was taken from him. A Rick, the entity the show refers to as Rick Prime, caused the death of his wife. The show presents this through the reconstructed memories. C-137 being offered a choice, refusing to cooperate with something, and then the consequences of that refusal arriving in the most devastating form possible. His wife killed, his family shattered, his reasons for the settled life destroyed. The aftermath of that loss is where C-137's transformation happens. He doesn't accept it. He pursues Rick Prime. He chases the Rick who took his family across dimensions, across years, across choices that pull him deeper and deeper into the infrastructure of the Rick community. Because Rick Prime is somewhere in that infrastructure, and finding him requires being inside it. This pursuit and the obsession it represents is what drew C-137 toward the construction of the Central Finite Curve. Not because he designed it alone, but because his presence in the depths of the Rick community at a formative moment in the Citadel's development meant that he was there when the Curve's architecture was being built. He participated. The specifics of that participation are encoded in memories that Evil Morty has spent 2 years gathering. There is a dimension of C-137's backstory that the episode treats with particular care. The reason he has had different versions of this origin story at different points in the series. The show had previously, in Season 3, shown Rick C-137 giving what appeared to be an origin story under the influence of a memory-altering experience. That story involved a Rick from another dimension killing his wife. But Season 3 also established that C-137 was being manipulated in that sequence, that the memory presented could be artificial. The ambiguity was deliberate. The show was withholding the real answer. Rickmurai Jack provides what appears to be the genuine version. The elements are similar to previous references: a Rick, a wife, a loss, a pursuit, but with the specificity and the emotional texture that distinguishes a real memory from a constructed one. The grief in the presentation is not generic. It's particular. It's the kind of particular that tells you this is what actually happened, not a simplified version designed to explain a character. C-137 has been carrying this. The show suggests, in the way the episode treats this revelation, that C-137 has not been entirely honest with himself about his own history. Not that the memories were hidden from him in the way he hid Morty's memories, but that the weight of them, the consequences of the choices he made in the aftermath, have been something he's managed by keeping them in the background rather than looking at them directly. Evil Morty is making him look at them directly. Not to hurt him, not primarily anyway, because the memories contain the technical information needed to complete the plan. The specific connection between C-137's memories and the Curve's construction is where the episode requires careful attention. What C-137 participated in during the period when he was deep in the Rick community pursuing Rick Prime was foundational work on the architecture of the multiverse as Ricks know it, the construction of the Citadel's dimensional infrastructure, the work that eventually became the Central Finite Curve. He was part of the team, or the process, or both, that drew the wall around the portion of the multiverse where Ricks are always supreme. The question the episode implies, though doesn't fully answer, is whether C-137 fully understood what he was participating in. The show is honest about the complexity here. A younger C-137, pursuing vengeance, operating in an environment shaped by the Rick community's values and priorities, might have participated in the Curve's construction without fully registering its moral
moral implications, or he might have understood and agreed in the context of what he was going through at the time, or he might have been instrumentalized, used by others who needed his specific contribution without telling him the full picture. The show leaves this appropriately ambiguous. What matters for Evil Morty's plan is that the memories contain the architectural information. What it means for C-137's moral accounting is a question the show lets C-137 carry rather than resolving for you. The execution of the plan, once Evil Morty has confronted C-137 with the history, is rapid and terrifying in its efficiency. Evil Morty has been president of the Citadel for 2 years. He has spent that time positioning the institution's infrastructure for this moment. He knows where the structural vulnerabilities are. He knows how the Citadel's energy systems work. He knows how to sequence the events that will produce the outcome he needs. He has calculated this. He has prepared for every contingency he can anticipate. When he moves comprehensively. The Citadel begins to come apart. The systems that Evil Morty spent 2 years ostensibly governing are redirected toward the destruction he's been planning. The institution that housed and governed the Rick community, that provided the shared infrastructure, the political authority, the community of genius, is dismantled from within. Rick C-137, who is present for this, is in the position of someone trying to stop something that has already been put in motion by someone who has been planning it for years. He's reactive, he's powerful and capable and not passive. The episode gives him agency, gives him moments of genuine action, but he's responding to a situation that Evil Morty designed. Evil Morty is operating from the script he wrote. C-137 is improvising against it. The confrontation between them during the episode's extended middle section is not primarily a fight. It's more like an argument conducted in the middle of a catastrophe. They're both moving, both operating, but the essential dynamic is that Evil Morty is explaining and C-137 is resisting, not just physically, but intellectually, not fully accepting what he's being told about his own history and its connection to the curve. Evil Morty doesn't need C-137's acceptance. He needs the information the memories contain, which he's already accessed. The explanation he offers is not a request for consent. It's more like a courtesy, or maybe it's something else, a moment of actually wanting to be heard, to have the thing he's been building understood by someone before he walks away from the world that contains everyone who might understand it. The show is careful not to make this into sentimentality. Evil Morty's relationship to Rick C-137 is not affection. It's the relationship of someone who has spent years studying the person most connected to the thing you're trying to destroy. Familiarity without warmth. Understanding without kinship. He knows C-137 better than almost anyone, and he doesn't particularly like him, and he doesn't need his approval. But he tells him, he lays it out, and then he walks away. The portal forms. The mechanics of how Evil Morty accesses and breaks through the curve, using the Citadel's energy, using the architectural information from C-137's memories, using the technology he's been preparing during his presidency, are shown through effect rather than explained in technical detail. What you see is the result, a portal that opens not to another dimension within the curve, but to something beyond it, a passage through the wall, the thing Evil Morty has been working toward since before the series began. The portal is gold. The light coming through it is warm, enormous, unlike the blue-green portals Rick's gun produces for intracurve travel. This is visually different from anything the show has shown before, which is the point. It's different because it's going somewhere different, somewhere the show's visual vocabulary doesn't have language for yet. Evil Morty walks toward it. He pauses. For a moment, before going through, he's still. The episode gives him this beat. He's looking back, not at Rick C-137 specifically, but at the Citadel, at the world, at everything on this side of the wall he's about to pass through. What is he thinking in that moment? The show doesn't give you access to it. It doesn't give him dialogue here, doesn't give him a parting expression that codes clearly as any particular emotion. He just pauses, and then he goes. The restraint of this moment is everything. A lesser piece of storytelling would give him a speech here, a villain's final declaration, a hero's last look at home. Evil Morty gets neither of those things. He gets a pause, a breath, and then the portal. He walks through it. The golden light takes him. The portal closes. Behind him, the Citadel continues to come apart. The destruction that Evil Morty set in motion does not stop when he leaves. The systems he dismantled, the energy he redirected, the structural collapse he engineered, it continues. The Citadel burns, in the particular sense that a structure's underlying logic burns when the infrastructure supporting it is gone. The physical institution may survive in some form, but the Citadel as it was, the Citadel as the governing body of a bounded multiverse organized around Rick's supremacy, is done. The Central Finite Curve, which Evil Morty's operation targeted, fails. The wall comes down. The boundary between the curated multiverse and the infinite multiverse beyond it dissolves.
The dimensional space that was the curve's interior is now continuous with everything outside it. The box is open. The walls are gone. The multiverse that the Citadel governed, the multiverse that the Rick/Morty dynamic operated within, is now a smaller, undifferentiated portion of something incomparably larger. Rick C-137 stands in the aftermath of this, the Citadel collapsing around him, the curve broken, his history exposed, his Morty, who has been present through the episode's events, beside him. The episode ends, Season 5 ends. Let's step back and look at what the episode accomplishes. It resolves Evil Morty's arc in the most complete possible way. Not defeated and imprisoned, not defeated and killed, not defeated and reformed. Succeeded. He got what he was trying to get. He's gone. The thing he went to get is now real. He accomplished his objective completely and is out of the accessible story. This is unusual for an antagonist arc in television. Villains don't typically win. They're stopped, or they're defeated, or they're neutralized, usually in a way that allows them to return if needed. Evil Morty's arc is not structured that way. He wins. He leaves. He doesn't need to return because there's nothing left for him here. He got the one thing he wanted. The show treating his success as the ending is also an act of moral honesty. His argument that the curve was a cage, that the multiverse available to him was artificially constrained for someone else's benefit, was correct. The show doesn't punish him for being right by having him fail at the last moment. It lets the correct analysis produce the correct outcome. He understood the architecture. He broke the architecture. He left. That's the shape of his story, and it's a remarkable shape. The way Rickmurai Jack structures its reveals deserves careful attention because the episode is doing something unusual. It's resolving two different, long-running storylines simultaneously, and each resolution illuminates the other. Rick C-137's origin and Evil Morty's plan come to their conclusions in the same episode, and the connection between them, the fact that C-137's history is not incidental to Evil Morty's operation, but central to it, is part of what gives the finale its weight. Rick C-137's backstory, as revealed in Rickmurai Jack, is this. He is not the original Rick C-137. The original was a different Rick, one whose wife and infant daughter were killed by another Rick, the Rick we come to know as Rick Prime. The Rick who became C-137 is the Rick who was radicalized by that loss. The Rick who refused to join the Citadel, who refused to build a portal gun when Rick Prime offered him the design, who lived as a lone operator outside the institutional structure. That refusal, that identity, is downstream of a specific act of violence by a specific individual. Rick C-137 didn't choose to be the Rick who doesn't participate in the Citadel out of pure philosophical independence. He was shaped into that position by grief, by loss, by the experience of having the people he loved killed and then being asked to operate as if that was fine. The independence wasn't just about freedom from institutional constraint. It was about refusing to be part of anything associated with the universe of beings that produced the Rick who killed his family. This backstory recontextualizes everything Rick C-137 has been in the show. The apparent nihilism, the drinking, the complicated relationship with Morty that swings between genuine love and exploitation. The refusal of Citadel membership that always seemed like it was about freedom, but turns out to be as much about damage. He's not free, he's running. He's been running for the entirety of the show's timeline. Evil Morty knew this. He had the memories. He'd seen the origin. He understood Rick C-137 not as the brilliant, chaotic free agent the Citadel files described him as, but as a being shaped by a specific wound, operating in specific ways because of that wound. That understanding is what made C-137 useful, not just as a frame target in Season 1, not just as an institution-adjacent figure whose profile made him useful for Evil Morty's purposes, but as the specific person whose specific memories contain the technical information needed to break the curve. The moment of confrontation in Rickmurai Jack, Evil Morty and Rick C-137 facing each other in the Citadel, with the plan in its final phase, is one of the show's stranger climactic scenes. There's almost no conventional dramatic antagonism in it. Evil Morty doesn't threaten Rick. He doesn't monologue about his pain. He explains what he's doing. He gives Rick the memories. He shows him the curve. He tells him what it is and why he's destroying it. The explanation is not a mercy. It's not a sign of respect for C-137. It's operational. C-137's understanding,
his presence as the specific Rick whose memories power the final mechanism may be necessary for the technical process. Or Evil Morty may simply have decided that C-137 deserves to understand what his history was actually part of before the thing built around that history is gone. Or both. The show leaves the motivation ambiguous. What's notable is what doesn't happen. Rick C-137 doesn't stop Evil Morty. He witnesses. He receives the memories. He watches the Citadel burn around him as Evil Morty uses its accumulated energy. And he doesn't intervene to prevent it. Whatever complicated feelings he has about the institution, about the Morty who spent years studying him, about the plan being executed, he doesn't stop it. This non-intervention is significant. Rick C-137 is, in the show's cosmology, one of the most capable beings in the accessible multiverse. If he had decided that Evil Morty's action was one he needed to prevent, he has the capacity to attempt that prevention. He doesn't attempt it. He watches. He lets it happen. The show doesn't explain his internal state in that moment, but the choice to not intervene from a being of his capability is itself a kind of decision, a kind of acknowledgement. After Evil Morty walks through the portal and the Citadel is gone, the scene settles into something quiet. The episode doesn't cut immediately to the aftermath. It lets the moment sit. The Citadel's destruction, the portal, the absence where a character had been, the show allows the weight of it to register before moving on. This pacing choice is characteristic of how the show has treated Evil Morty throughout. His significant moments are given space. Not a lot of space, the show never lingers, but enough. The eye patch removal in Season 1 was given a beat. The victory speech in Season 3 was given a beat. The portal exit in Season 5 is given a beat. Each of these is a moment where the show trusts the viewer to feel something without being told what to feel. The feeling isn't triumph. It isn't exactly tragedy either. It's something more like the specific sensation of watching a plan reach its conclusion after years of investment in understanding it. A kind of recognition that what just happened was inevitable, had been inevitable for a long time, and was always going to look like this. Not like a battle won or lost, but like a door closing. Evil Morty is gone. Not dead, gone. Into an infinite multiverse that doesn't have a predefined map, where the cosmological guarantee of Rick's supremacy no longer applies, where whoever or whatever he encounters will encounter him as whatever he actually is, rather than as a category the system assigned him to. Whether that's freedom, the show doesn't say, but it's outside, and outside is what he was always building toward. The timing of when Evil Morty chose to act, in Rickmurai Jack, the Season 5 finale, at the specific moment in C-137's arc when his origin is being revealed, is worth examining because it doesn't seem accidental. Season 5 had been building toward the revelation of C-137's backstory through the Morty Night run, and then through the finale's focus on the Rick/Bird-Person relationship and its complications. The show was clearly moving towards something about C-137's origin in this season's arc. Evil Morty's choice to execute his plan in the finale of this particular season, at the moment when C-137's suppressed memories are surfacing anyway, suggests either extraordinary timing or, more likely, that the timing was deliberate. Evil Morty was monitoring C-137 closely enough to know when the memories were becoming accessible and chose to act when the convergence of circumstances made his plan most efficient. This level of surveillance, tracking C-137's psychological state closely enough to know when his suppressed memories were becoming accessible, implies an ongoing intelligence operation that extended throughout Evil Morty's presidency and possibly before. He wasn't just gathering static data, he was tracking a dynamic target, waiting for the right moment. And the moment came in the Season 5 finale, when everything the show had been building toward in C-137's personal arc was also reaching a convergence. The effect, dramatically, is that C-137's most personal story and Evil Morty's most operational story become inseparable at their conclusions. The episode that finally answers the most intimate questions about C-137, who he was before, what he lost, what made him who he is also the episode where Evil Morty uses that intimate history as the instrument of the multiverse's structural transformation. Personal and structural, origin and conclusion are woven together in the same hour of television. What Evil Morty says to Rick C-137 in their confrontation is minimal. The show, consistent with its treatment of Evil Morty throughout, gives him very few words for a moment of this significance. What he says about the curve is essentially a description. He explains what
what it is. He doesn't explain why he's doing it. Beyond the implicit, the description of the curve is self-evidently a justification for destroying it, and he presumably trusts C-137 to understand the implications without a lengthy elaboration. This mirrors something about how Evil Morty has been characterized throughout. He communicates efficiently, without the performance of explaining himself that most characters engage in when they're at their moment of maximum leverage. Most antagonists, when they've won, explain themselves extensively. The victory speech, the justification, the demand that the protagonists understand and acknowledge what's been accomplished. Evil Morty doesn't do this. He says what needs to be said for operational purposes and lets the action speak. The operational purpose of what he tells C-137 may be what the show implies. C-137's understanding, or at least his presence and attention, is part of the mechanism. The memories being actively recalled, not just stored, but surfaced and experienced, may be part of what makes the technical process work. If so, the conversation isn't an indulgence. It's the last step of the plan. Or it might be that Evil Morty wanted C-137 to understand, at least once, clearly and completely, what he'd been living inside. The curve, its purpose, who built it, what it was for. C-137's genius existed in a manufactured context, and for the duration of that context's existence, C-137 moved through it as if it were simply reality. Evil Morty destroyed the context and, in the moments before destroying it, gave C-137 the information he needed to see it for what it was. Whether that's a gift or a wound, the show leaves to C-137 to figure out. He's the one who has to live in the aftermath. Section 9. Beyond the Curve. Evil Morty goes through the portal at the end of Season 5, Episode 10, and the show doesn't follow him through. That's not a narrative oversight, it's a choice. The show has been deliberate about every other choice it made in structuring his arc. When to show him, when to withhold him, what to reveal, and what to leave in shadow. The decision not to follow him through the portal is the same kind of deliberateness. He went somewhere the show doesn't have language for yet. Following him would require the show to have a story to tell about where he went, and the show, at this point, either doesn't have that story or has decided to let the question sit open. This section is about what the show confirms happened after the Season 5 finale, and about how Evil Morty's absence shapes the story that followed him. The immediate aftermath of the finale, for Rick C-137, is a reckoning. The events of Rickmurai Jack expose things C-137 had, in various ways, been carrying without fully examining. His actual origin story, the family he lost, the pursuit of Rick Prime, his involvement with the Curve's construction, is now out in the open. Not publicly, not institutionally, but C-137 himself has been made to look at it. Evil Morty forced the confrontation. He assembled the evidence, presented it, and then left C-137 with it. Season 6 is substantially about the consequences of that confrontation. C-137 is now in active pursuit of Rick Prime, the Rick whose actions created the tragedy that shaped C-137's entire subsequent existence. The Season 5 finale surfacing this history is directly related to the Season 6 arc. Evil Morty, by excavating C-137's past and using it as a mechanism for his plan, also forced C-137 to acknowledge what he's been avoiding. The pursuit of Rick Prime, which was dormant or suppressed in the years we've watched the show, becomes active. Evil Morty didn't intend to do C-137 a favor, but the confrontation with his own history, while not therapeutic in any immediate sense, removes the possibility of continued avoidance. C-137 can't pretend not to know anymore. He has to deal with it. The Citadel's status after the finale is something the show addresses partially through inference and partially through later references. The institution is not completely destroyed in the physical sense. Elements of it presumably survived the collapse. Rick's and Morty's who lived within it, pieces of its infrastructure, the knowledge its members carried. But the Citadel as a governing institution, as the political structure that organized and governed the Rick community within the bounded multiverse, is functionally over. The Council of Ricks had already been destroyed in Season 3. The presidency, the new governance structure, lasted exactly as long as Evil Morty's tenure. After he walked out through the portal, there was no president, no council, no governing authority. The institution whose authority it was to reconstruct governance was itself the thing that had just been dismantled. The Citadel's population, all the ordinary Ricks and Mortys who lived in it, worked in it, organized their lives around its institutions, woke up the morning after the Season 5 finale in a world where their political structure was gone, their multiverse's defining boundary had dissolved, and the person responsible was no longer accessible for accountability. The show doesn't spend extended time on these individual individuals' experiences after the finale. The perspective returns to C-137 and Morty, to the continuing story of their partnership and C-137's pursuit of Rick Prime. The Citadel's ordinary population bears the cost of what Evil Morty did and is largely off-screen when that cost comes due. The Central Finite Curve's dissolution is the change with the largest long-term implications, and the show has begun to work out what those implications are without fully resolving them. If the curve existed to ensure that Ricks were always the smartest beings in their accessible multiverse, then the curve's dissolution means that Ricks are now operating in a multiverse that contains dimensions where they aren't, where there are entities smarter, more capable, more powerful, where the assumptions that have been the foundation of Rick's self-concept and the Citadel's organizing principle no longer hold. This is a significant change to the show's cosmological setup. The world that Rick C-137 operates in after Season 5 is genuinely different from the world he was in before. Not in every immediate day-to-day way. The fabric of individual dimensions wasn't changed by the curve's dissolution, and C-137's specific life within his home dimension continues to look approximately as it did. But the larger context, the multiverse available for adventure, the population of beings Rick might encounter, the question of whether Rick is always the most capable entity in any given situation, that context is different. Season 6 and Season 7 operate in this changed context. The show is still finding the full implications of the change. Some of what the changed context means is already visible in the kinds of threats and situations the show explores after Season 5. Some of it may be worked out in future seasons. Where is Evil Morty? He's beyond the curve. He walked through the portal into the portion of the multiverse where the Rick/Morty dynamics logic doesn't apply, and he's been there since the Season 5 finale. The show hasn't shown him. As of my knowledge cutoff in August 2025, through Season 7, Evil Morty has not appeared in any confirmed substantial capacity following his Season 5 exit. His absence is held. The show doesn't explain it or address it. It simply maintains it. He left. He's gone. The story on this side of the portal continues without him. What's remarkable about this absence is how complete it is, and how the show is okay with that. Evil Morty's story is finished, in the sense that the arc the show built for him reached its conclusion. He isn't needed narratively for anything that happens after Season 5. The things he put in motion, the curve's dissolution, C-137's confrontation with his own history, the Citadel's destruction, those things have ongoing consequences that shape the story, but they don't require Evil Morty's presence to continue shaping it. He's like someone who removed a load-bearing wall and then left the building. The structural change is real and ongoing. He doesn't have to stay to supervise the consequences. The question of what Evil Morty is doing beyond the curve is one the show will presumably return to at some point. He's not dead. He's not imprisoned. He's not neutralized. He's free in the most complete sense available in the show's universe. Free in a portion of reality that nobody in the show's established world has ever been, operating without the constraints of the structure that defined his entire existence up to the moment he left it. What does that look like? The uncurated multiverse, everything beyond the curve, is unknown territory. Not just for Evil Morty, for everyone. No Rick from the Citadel has ever gone there. The dimensions outside the curve are, by definition, dimensions where Rick's specific form of genius isn't the apex of intelligence. They might be entirely different in other respects too. Different physics, different kinds of beings, different histories of development. The infinite multiverse contains everything. Outside the curated sample, everything means everything. Evil Morty is a Morty. He has whatever capabilities a Morty has, physically ordinary, without innate superpowers or genius-level scientific ability. He presumably left with whatever technology he could take through the portal, whatever knowledge he's accumulated over the years of his plan's execution, and whatever resources he had access to in his final moments as president of the Citadel. In a multiverse that isn't organized around Rick's supremacy, what is a Morty? What does that identity even mean? A Morty outside the curve is a person from a specific place, with a specific history, with specific capabilities, but without the definitional relationship to Rick that gives the word Morty its meaning within the curve. He's just a person. Maybe that's exactly what he wanted. There's something about the image of Evil Morty walking through the portal that the show returns to implicitly in how it treats his absence. The walk is not triumphant in the way a villain's victory usually looks. It's not defiant. It's not bitter. It has the quality of someone who finished a very long piece of work and is leaving the job site. He built the thing he needed to build. He dismantled the thing he needed to dismantle. He went to the place he was trying to get to. The emotional
emotional register for someone who has spent this much of their life on a plan this demanding is not elation, it's completion. The specific quietness of having finished something you committed to a long time ago and spent years getting done. Whether what comes next is better, whether the uncurated multiverse delivers whatever he was hoping for when he broke through the wall to reach it, is unknown. The show gives him the exit. It doesn't promise him happiness. It doesn't promise him anything except out. He got out. What he made of it is a question for stories the show hasn't told yet. Season 6 follows Rick C-137 in the aftermath of the Curve's destruction, with a specificity that makes the consequences feel tangible rather than abstract. The most immediate consequence is technical. His portal gun no longer works reliably. The device was built for operation within the Curve's particular configuration of the multiverse, and outside it, or in the partially restructured multiverse that follows its destruction, the technology's underlying assumptions no longer hold in the same way. This is a remarkable kind of consequence for a long-running action series to dwell on. The protagonist's signature piece of equipment doesn't work properly anymore because the cosmological structure it was designed for has been altered. This isn't damage that can be repaired. It's not a problem that Rick's genius can simply solve. The Curve's absence has changed the underlying reality in ways that require starting from different premises, and the portal gun was built on the old premises. The show uses this to follow C-137 into territory the series hadn't fully explored before. Rick genuinely constrained by circumstances rather than choosing his constraints. The freedom of the pre-Curve Rick was always partly performed. He was choosing his isolation, choosing his independence, choosing not to use the Citadel's infrastructure. Post-Curve, the infrastructure doesn't exist to use even if he wanted to. The Citadel is gone. The portal gun is unreliable. The multiverse he's navigating is larger and less mapped than the one he knew. The question of what happened to the Citadel's population after its destruction is one the show handles obliquely. The Citadel, as a physical structure, was used as fuel for the Curve's destruction. This implies the structure itself was consumed. What happened to the Ricks and Mortys who were on the Citadel when it burned is not addressed directly in the subsequent episodes. This is one of the harder aspects of Evil Morty's legacy to sit with. The Citadel wasn't just an abstract institution. It was a physical place where beings lived, worked, went to school, ran shops, raised families in whatever form family takes in that context. When Evil Morty converted the Citadel's energy into the force that broke the Curve, the people inside it were part of what was destroyed or dispersed. The show doesn't ask you to grieve for the Citadel. It spent enough time showing you what the Citadel was that a certain degree of ambivalence about its destruction is invited. But the people inside it weren't all the Council of Ricks, weren't all complicit architects of the system's worst qualities. Some of them were the factory Mortys from the Ricklantis Mixup. Some of them were the cop Ricks trying to do the job right. Some of them were just people who lived in the only community they'd ever known. Evil Morty's plan consumed them, not as a side effect he tried to minimize, as the mechanism. The Citadel's population, in aggregate, was the energy source. Their destruction was structural, not incidental. And whether Evil Morty calculated this cost and decided it was acceptable, or whether he simply didn't weight it as a relevant variable, the show leaves open. His opacity on this, as on everything, is complete. The period between Season 5 and the end of Season 7, the window the show gives us of the post-Curve world without Evil Morty in it, is worth reading as evidence for what the Curve's destruction actually changed about the show's world. Rick C-137's pursuit of Rick Prime across Season 6 is enabled by the post-Curve multiverse in specific ways. Prime is no longer operating inside a bounded structure where Rick's movement patterns could be anticipated. The infinite unstructured multiverse is harder to hide in systematically, but also harder to navigate and track efficiently. C-137 is hunting in conditions that neither hunter nor hunted was designed for. The show's post-Curve atmosphere has a different quality from the pre-Curve episodes. Harder to define, easier to feel. The accessibility of the multiverse feels different when it isn't curated. The adventures have different stakes when there's no institutional backstop, no Citadel that might have resources, no council that might be petitioned, no shared infrastructure that any Rick in any dimension could theoretically access. The world is larger and colder and less organized. Evil Morty's absence from Seasons 6 and 7 is not incidental. The show could have brought him back immediately and explored the consequences of his action through direct follow-up. It didn't. His absence is part of how the show conveys what his action meant. The consequences are felt indirectly through the changed quality of every
everything else, rather than through a character who shows up and explains what changed. He left, and the world he changed kept going without him in it, and what he changed shows in the texture of that going. Through Season 7's confirmed events, he doesn't appear. Whether the future holds further appearances is genuinely unknown as of the show's most recent season. The arc as completed through Season 5 is self-contained. It has a beginning, a middle, and an ending. What comes after the ending, if anything, would be a new chapter rather than a continuation of the existing arc. Rick C-137's Season 6 arc, The Pursuit of Rick Prime, is the most direct consequence of Rickmurai Jack that the show follows in real time. With the curve gone and the Citadel destroyed, C-137's operational context has changed completely. He's no longer the Rick who refuses to engage with Citadel infrastructure. There's no infrastructure to refuse. He's just a Rick in an unstructured multiverse, with a malfunctioning portal gun and a specific target. The change in his situation has visible effects on his behavior. He's more focused in Season 6 than in previous seasons. The diffuse, chaotic energy that characterized him in earlier seasons has contracted around the specific purpose of finding Rick Prime. The grief and anger that were always there but usually sublimated into adventure and nihilism have risen to the surface because the contextual structures that organized his life, the Citadel to avoid, the Galactic Federation to work around, the multiverse infrastructure to exploit, have been altered enough that the underlying emotional reality has become more visible. This change in C-137 is indirectly a consequence of Evil Morty's action, not because Evil Morty intended to change C-137's emotional landscape, but because the destruction of the Curve and the Citadel removed the structures that had been managing C-137's grief at a distance. The busyness of operating inside a complex institutional landscape, even in opposition to it, is a form of distance from yourself. When the landscape simplifies, the self becomes less avoidable. The larger question of what the post-Curve multiverse is like, not just for C-137, but for the infinite dimensions that were inside the Curve's boundary, is one the show addresses incompletely through Season 7. The Curve's absence presumably means that the accessible multiverse is now larger. Dimensions that were outside the Curve's boundary are now, at least in principle, accessible. Beings and civilizations that were outside the boundary can now enter. What's out there, beyond the Curve's former edges, is genuinely unknown. The show has been set for its entire run inside a curated portion of the multiverse. The curation was invisible to most of its inhabitants, but real and consequential. Now the curation is gone. The doors are open. What comes through them, or what was already there and can now be encountered, is unexplored territory. This is one of the most significant implications of Evil Morty's action that the show has yet to develop fully. Not the domestic consequences, what happens to C-137, what happens to the characters we've been following, but the cosmological ones. The shape of the accessible multiverse has changed. The guarantees that defined it have been dissolved. What that means in terms of what gets encountered and what becomes possible is the open question that the post-Curve world is navigating. Evil Morty himself in the post-Curve world is absent from the show's frame. He went through the portal and the show hasn't followed him. This absence is, again, consistent with how the show has treated him. He exists in the gaps, shows up at the operative moments, and disappears between them. The gap after the portal is just the longest one yet. If he appears again, and the door is open in narrative terms for future appearances, what would he be? The structural grievances that defined his arc have been addressed, at least in the sense that the structure is gone, the Curve is destroyed, the Citadel is destroyed, the institution that produced him and the cosmological framework it existed within are both gone. He went outside. He's in a multiverse that doesn't have a predefined category for what a Morty is, because the institution that maintained those categories doesn't exist anymore. What he does with that, whether the outside turns out to be what he hoped it would be, whether the freedom from categorization produces the kind of existence he was working toward, or whether it produces something else entirely, is genuinely unknown. The show could go anywhere with it, or it might never revisit it. Evil Morty's arc, as completed through Season 5, is narratively whole. It doesn't need a sequel, but the door isn't locked. For now, he's gone. The world he changed is continuing, and the story he was part of, the story of a being who understood a structure clearly enough to dismantle it, has reached its ending, quiet and complete, in the image of a portal closing behind someone who didn't look back. The show's treatment of the aftermath is notable for what it chooses to focus on versus what it leaves off-screen. It follows Rick C-137 C-137's grief and his pursuit of Rick Prime. It depicts the broken portal gun and the navigational difficulty of the post-Curve multiverse. It doesn't follow any surviving Mortys or Ricks from the Citadel's population through their displacement. This narrative choice is consistent with the show's center of gravity. C-137 is the protagonist, and the aftermath is filtered through his experience. But the choice also has an effect on how the audience processes the Citadel's destruction. We feel it through C-137's changed circumstances. We don't feel it through the experiences of the Citadel's surviving population, whoever they are and wherever they ended up after the institution that housed them ceased to exist. That asymmetry, the consequence experienced by the protagonist versus the consequence experienced by the institution's population, is another way the show avoids resolving the moral question of Evil Morty's action. To dwell on the surviving Mortys would be to invite grief for what was lost, alongside acknowledgement that what was lost was unjust. The show sidesteps that by keeping the camera on C-137. Whether that's an artistic choice, a resource limitation, or a deliberate decision about where the show's emotional attention belongs, the effect is the same. The full weight of what the destruction cost is not rendered on screen. Section 10. Looking back and forward. This section to cover confirmed Season 9 appearances. As of my knowledge cutoff in August 2025, Season 9 of Rick and Morty had not aired. This section therefore reflects on the full confirmed arc through Season 7 and considers what the complete shape of Evil Morty's story, as the show built it, actually means. Let's start at the beginning again and look at the whole thing at once. Season 1, Episode 10. A young boy removes an eye patch. A Morty revealed at the center of a conspiracy. The image holds for a few seconds and he's gone. Most viewers watching that scene in 2014 probably experienced it as a satisfying twist. The villain was a Morty, and then filed it in the back of their mind as a clever piece of writing and moved on. Season 3, Episode 7. 2 seasons later, no appearances in between. A presidential candidate, a Morty running for the highest office in the Citadel, campaigning accurately on the genuine suffering of the Morty population, winning. And then, at the end of the episode, bodies floating in space and Evil Morty at the podium. The twist is more complex this time. It's not just this person is dangerous, it's this person used your hope as a tool. Season 5, Episode 10. 2 more seasons. A confrontation, a revelation, a portal opening into gold, an exit through the wall at the edge of the known multiverse. The show lets him go. The arc concludes. 3 appearances, 2 long absences. An arc that spans the show's first 5 seasons without ever becoming a centerpiece, without ever dominating the narrative, without ever announcing itself as the most important thing. And then, at the end, the most consequential single act in the show's cosmological history, performed by a background character the show introduced with a single 30-second scene in its first season. That's the shape of it, and the shape is remarkable. Part of what makes the arc work is the economy of Evil Morty's appearances. The show never overexposed him. It never gave you so much of him that the mystery evaporated or the character became routine. Every appearance advanced the story, revealed something new, and then ended before it could overstay. When he's absent, you carry the knowledge of what he is and what he's doing, off-screen, unseen, planning. And that carrying contributes to the weight of his eventual re-emergence. Television is full of long-running mysteries that run too long. Characters whose potential outstrips the story's ability to pay it off. Antagonists who are so built up across seasons that the payoff can't possibly match the anticipation. Evil Morty avoids all of this. The payoff is in exact proportion to the setup. Not more, not less. It lands where the show aimed it. The reason for that precision is, probably, that the show knew what he was doing from early on. The arc didn't develop accidentally. The Season 5 finale reveals the curve. C-137's history, the specific technical mechanism, don't feel like retroactive invention. They feel like the things that were always there, underneath the story, waiting to be shown. The show planted the seeds and then actually grew them, rather than planting seeds and deciding later they were doing something else. Evil Morty is unusual among television antagonists in that his victimhood and his villainy coexist without either canceling the other. He is genuinely a product of an unjust system. The exploitation of Mortys within the Citadel is real. The use of Mortys as brainwave camouflage is real. The structural exclusion of Mortys from governance and and power within the Rick-organized multiverse is real. The Central Finite Curve, the deepest expression of that exploitation, was real and was genuinely constructed by Ricks to serve Rick interests at everyone else's expense. Evil Morty understands all of this with unusual clarity. He's not wrong about any of it. His analysis of what the Citadel is and what the Curve is and what it means to be a Morty within that structure is accurate. The show validates his diagnosis. And he is also genuinely a person who killed people, who manipulated people who trusted him, who used the genuine suffering of the Morty population as a platform for his personal escape without any intention of alleviating that suffering, who left behind, when he walked through the portal, a destroyed institution whose collapse cost real people real things. These two truths coexist in him. The show doesn't resolve them. It presents both, clearly and without softening either, and trusts you to hold them together. This is the most sophisticated thing the show does with the character. It doesn't let you settle on a verdict. You can't cleanly condemn him because his grievances are legitimate and his analysis is correct. You can't cleanly admire him because his methods are monstrous and his care for other people's welfare is, at best, non-existent. He sits in the uncomfortable middle, where a lot of real moral complexity actually lives. The show has been building, across its entire run, toward a kind of argument about intelligence, meaning, and freedom. Rick's genius is central to that argument. What it costs, what it produces, whether being the smartest is inherently good or inherently a trap. The show treats Rick's intelligence as a double-edged thing throughout, the source of his most extraordinary achievements and the source of his most profound suffering. Evil Morty extends that argument in a direction the show hadn't explored before him. He's not a genius in Rick's sense, not a scientific innovator, not a dimension-spanning researcher, but he has a different kind of intelligence, the intelligence of systems. He understands how institutions work, how power operates, how to navigate complexity and use it. He has the patience and the long-term thinking that makes him, in certain respects, more effective than Rick in the specific domain of large-scale structural change. What the show does with that is to position Evil Morty as a character who demonstrates what a Morty becomes when the system's usual tools for keeping Mortys in their place don't work. If the Rick/Morty dynamic depends on Mortys not seeing clearly, on their limited access to information, their limited access to resources, their limited access to the kind of thinking the Citadel's education isn't designed to produce, then Evil Morty is what happens when a Morty acquires all of those things, when a Morty sees clearly, when a Morty has the resources and the time and the capability. He doesn't become Rick, he becomes something else, something that the Citadel's architecture didn't anticipate and didn't build a defense against. The question of what comes after, what happens in seasons and episodes that haven't aired yet, whether Evil Morty returns, what his story in the uncurated multiverse looks like, is genuinely open. What can be said about it, from the shape of everything that's come before, Evil Morty's story, as the show built it, is complete. The arc has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning is the Season 1 reveal. The middle is the long off-screen presidency and the Season 3 appearance. The end is the Season 5 finale. If the show returns to him, it will be extending beyond that complete arc, not resolving something left open, but beginning something new. That new thing could be many things. A story about what he found beyond the curve, a story about what the uncurated multiverse actually looks like when you arrive in it, a story about whether freedom from the structure delivers what you were hoping for when you spent years working toward it, a story that uses Evil Morty's perspective to show the audience something about the infinite multiverse that the Rick-centric frame never could. Or the show might not return to him at all. It might treat the Season 5 exit as genuinely final, a character who completed his arc and walked away, and whose absence from the continuing story is itself a kind of statement. He left, the story continued. The two things don't need to reconnect. Both options would be consistent with how the show has handled him up to this point. The show has been willing to let him be absent for long stretches when the story didn't need him. It would also be willing to return to him when it had a story worth telling from his perspective. What the show has definitively established through everything we've covered in this documentary, Evil Morty was the most consequential antagonist in Rick and Morty's history by the measure of the scale of what he changed. He dismantled the most powerful institution in the accessible multiverse. He dissolved the foundational boundary of the multiverse Ricks operated within. He exposed Rick C-137's hidden history in ways that changed the direction of the show's ongoing arc. The story after Season 5 is different from the story before it in ways that trace directly back
back to what Evil Morty did. He did all of this without superpowers, without Rick-level scientific genius. He did it with strategic intelligence, patience, and a clear-eyed analysis of how the systems around him worked and what their vulnerabilities were. He did it from inside the system, using the system's own mechanisms, the Citadel's democratic process, the presidency's institutional access, the Curve's architectural weaknesses, to dismantle it. He started as a background Morty with an eye patch and ended as the being who broke the wall around the known multiverse. Let's close slowly, the way this story deserves to be closed. The night Rick and Morty premiered, nobody knew that buried inside the show's anarchic multiverse adventures was this: a story about a boy who looked at the world he was given and refused it, who recognized clearly and early that the world he'd been born into was a cage, and that cages are built, and that what's built can be taken apart, who spent years, quietly and methodically, and at genuine human cost to other people, learning everything he needed to learn and positioning everything he needed to position, who didn't rage, who didn't make speeches about justice, who didn't ask for acknowledgement or sympathy or redemption, who just worked. And then, when the work was done, walked through the door. The golden light on the other side of the portal doesn't tell you what's there. It doesn't promise anything. It just shows you that there is an other side, that the world Evil Morty was born into was not all the world there is, and that the assumption to the contrary, which the entire Rick-organized multiverse was built on and maintained with enormous effort and at enormous cost, was wrong. He proved it was wrong by going through. Whatever he finds out there, whatever the uncurated multiverse contains, whatever a Morty becomes when there are no Ricks to define what a Morty is a story the show hasn't told yet. Maybe it will. Maybe it won't need to. He got out. He's gone. The world he left behind is different because he was in it, and different because he left it. That's enough. That's more than enough. Sleep well. End of script. Total approximate word count, approximately 38,000 to 40,000 words. Sections run between 3,500 to 4,500 words each. Pacing note: narration should allow 2 to 3 second pauses at section breaks. Ambient music should fade to near silence during the final paragraph of section 10. Hold silence for 5 to 7 seconds before any end screen content. The specific structure of Rickmurai Jack's third act, the sequence from Evil Morty's reveal of the memories to the destruction of the Curve, is worth examining closely because it's one of the most densely packed sequences in the show's run. Multiple things are happening simultaneously, and the show trusts the viewer to hold them all at once. First, the memories. Evil Morty has been gathering Rick C-137's memories, specifically, over a period that implies the intelligence operation has been running across multiple seasons. He has memories of Rick's origin, the moment Rick Prime killed C-137's wife and daughter, creating the character we've been watching since season 1. These are memories Rick himself had suppressed or buried. Evil Morty has them. The fact that he has them means he's been working at a level of access to C-137's psychology that C-137 didn't know about. This has several implications. 1. Evil Morty identified Rick C-137 as the person whose memories he needed, which means he understood something about C-137's specific history and its relevance to his plan. He wasn't gathering any Rick's memories, he was gathering this Rick's memories. 2. The gathering required either direct proximity to C-137 at some point, or access to the Citadel's surveillance infrastructure, which the presidency would have provided. 3. The memories he shows C-137 are not just incidentally painful, they are the foundation of C-137's entire behavioral profile. Evil Morty understands Rick C-137 from the inside. The confrontation between them in the episode's climax is one of the strangest in the series because it's not really a confrontation in the dramatic sense. Evil Morty isn't trying to hurt C-137. He's not running a revenge narrative. He explains what he's doing. He shows C-137 the memories. He tells C-137 what the Curve is. And then he uses the Citadel itself, the massed energy of an institution built on Rick genius across infinite dimensions to destroy the barrier. The Citadel is the fuel. Every Rick, every Morty, every resource the institution has accumulated. Evil Morty uses all of it to power the destruction of the thing the institution was built inside. The most powerful institution in the accessible multiverse is used as the instrument of its own undoing. And the person doing this is a Morty. There's a moment in the episode that's easy to miss on first viewing. The realization that that Evil Morty's plan required Rick C-137 specifically, not just as an optional component, as a necessary one. The memories of C-137's origin, the specific record of what Rick Prime did, were central to the technical architecture of destroying the curve, which means Evil Morty wasn't running a parallel operation to C-137's story. He was running an operation that depended on C-137's story. The show doesn't fully explain why C-137's memories were necessary for curve destruction. It implies the connection without spelling it out, but the implication is suggestive. The curve was built, in part, around C-137's specific configuration of genius, or its destruction requires something specific to him. Rick C-137 is not just the protagonist the show has been following. He's, in some sense, the key. This adds retrospective weight to the Season 1 operation. Evil Morty framed C-137 in Season 1. Was that just an opportunistic choice of a convenient target? Or was C-137 already identified as the person whose memories he would eventually need? The show leaves this ambiguous, but it's the kind of ambiguity that makes you go back and rewatch the earlier episodes, looking for evidence in one direction or the other. After the curve breaks and Evil Morty goes through the portal, the show follows Rick C-137's story into Season 6, where C-137 pursues Rick Prime across an unstructured multiverse. The collapse of the curve has direct consequences for C-137. His portal gun stops working reliably in the post-curve environment. The technology was built for operation inside the curve. Outside it, the infinite unstructured multiverse doesn't behave in ways the technology was designed for. This is a tangible, mechanical consequence of Evil Morty's action that the show follows through. He didn't just make a philosophical point about freedom from hierarchical structures. He broke something that the entire infrastructure of the show had relied on. The portal gun, C-137's defining piece of technology, the tool that makes his adventures possible, stops working properly because the cosmological environment it was built for no longer exists in the same configuration. Evil Morty, by destroying the curve, broke Rick's most important tool. Whether he intended this as a specific consequence of the curve's destruction, or whether it was collateral damage he was indifferent to, the show doesn't say. But the effect is real, and the show portrays it as a genuine complication for C-137 in the aftermath. The Citadel, meanwhile, is gone. The institution that housed and structured the Rick/Morty dynamic across infinite dimensions, the institution that assigned Mortys to Ricks, that ran the labor economy, that governed through the council, was destroyed when Evil Morty used it as fuel. There's no Citadel to return to. There's no Council of Ricks to reassemble authority. There's just the open multiverse, with its previous custodial institution eliminated, and whatever comes next is genuinely unknown. The closing reflection that Evil Morty's arc invites, the thing you're left sitting with after you followed all of this from Season 1 to the portal moment in Season 5, is something about what liberation costs and whether the costs are worth it. Evil Morty destroyed the curve. From a purely structural standpoint, this is arguably the most significant event in the show's entire run. The Citadel's hierarchy, the guaranteed dominance of Rick-style genius across the accessible multiverse, the institutional scaffolding that define the relationship between intelligence and power in the world the show is set in, all of it is gone. If what Evil Morty was critiquing was genuinely unjust, and the show presents it as genuinely unjust, then what he accomplished was the dismantling of an unjust structure at cosmological scale. And the cost was every person who died to make it possible. The Ricks killed in Season 1, the individuals removed during the presidential campaign, the Citadel's entire population used as fuel without their consent for the final act. The show doesn't tell you how to weigh those against each other. It doesn't offer a verdict. Evil Morty walks through the portal and the show cuts away. What he finds outside the curve, whether it turns out to be what he hoped, whether the freedom was worth what it cost, none of that is shown. He escapes into the unknown, and the viewer is left with the question rather than the answer. That choice, to end with departure rather than resolution, with a question rather than a verdict, is the most honest thing the show could have done with this character. Evil Morty is not a character who invites simple assessment. He was formed by an unjust system. He understood that system better than anyone inside it. He dismantled it through methods that reproduced its worst qualities, and then he left. What he finds outside the curve is not the show's story. It might be, someday. For now, the story the show chose to tell ends at the portal, with a Morty who decided that the world as it was constituted was not one he was willing to remain inside, and who acquired the capability over years years of patient, invisible work to make that decision stick. That's the story of Evil Morty.
It starts with a controlled Rick and an eye patch, and it ends with a boy walking into an infinite universe that, for the first time in his existence, doesn't have a predefined category for what he is. Looking back at the arc from outside it, from the vantage point of having followed it all the way through, a few things stand out that are easy to miss when you're moving through it in real time. The first is how much the arc depends on what the show doesn't show. Evil Morty's arc is as much about absence as about presence. He's absent from seasons 2 and 4. His interiority is absent throughout. His origin is absent. The long stretches of operational work between his visible appearances are absent. The arc is defined by gaps, and those gaps aren't empty. They're where the viewer's imagination fills in the implications of what's been shown. The show gives you the endpoints and trusts you to build the middle. This is the opposite of how most long-form narrative antagonist arcs work. Usually the build is in the shown material. You accumulate understanding of the antagonist through exposure, through scenes that show their motivation and their method. With Evil Morty, the build is in the gaps. Each appearance is designed to prompt specific questions, and the questions carry forward through the seasons until the next appearance answers some of them and raises others. The second thing that stands out is the show's consistency about who Evil Morty is across all his appearances. He doesn't change. There's no arc of radicalization, no moment where he crosses a line and becomes someone different. He's the same character in season 1 and season 5, the same opacity, the same competence, the same patient commitment to an objective that the viewer only gradually understands. The arc is one of revelation, not transformation. He was always who he is. The show reveals that gradually. The question of Evil Morty's morality, whether he's a villain, a hero, an anti-hero, something else, is one the show actively resists resolving, and that resistance is itself meaningful. The show's refusal to resolve the moral question is not indifference, it's a position that the moral question is the wrong frame for understanding him. He's not a character whose actions should be evaluated primarily in terms of their moral quality. He's a character whose actions should be understood in terms of what they reveal about the structure he existed within and the structure he dismantled. That doesn't mean the moral question is irrelevant. People died. Consent was violated. Power was used in ways that reproduced the dynamics Evil Morty was critiquing. These things are real, and the show doesn't hide them, but the show presents them as complications rather than as the central point. The central point is what the Citadel was. The central point is what the Curve was. The central point is that Morty saw the structure clearly and found a way out. The morality of how he found the way out is a separate question from whether finding a way out was right. The show holds both questions open simultaneously, and the discomfort of holding both at once is exactly the discomfort the show is interested in producing. There's a specific quality to Evil Morty's characterization that doesn't have a clean name, but is worth trying to articulate. He's characterized as intelligent in a way that looks different from how the show characterizes Rick's intelligence. Rick's intelligence is demonstrative. He shows it. He explains it. He uses it to perform, to impress, to intimidate, to prove something about himself to himself and others. The genius is loud. It announces itself. It needs to be seen. Evil Morty's intelligence is instrumental. He uses it to accomplish objectives. He doesn't explain his reasoning. He doesn't perform his capability for an audience. He doesn't need anyone to recognize how clever he was. He needs the plan to work. The recognition is irrelevant to him in a way that it clearly isn't irrelevant to Rick. This difference is part of how the show characterizes them as fundamentally different kinds of beings, despite both being exceptions within their respective categories. Rick's genius is bound up with his identity in ways that create specific vulnerabilities: the need for recognition, the performance of uniqueness, the emotional investment in being the smartest. Evil Morty's intelligence doesn't seem to carry those vulnerabilities. He's not trying to prove anything. He's trying to do something. The intelligence is a tool, not a self-conception. That purely instrumental relationship with capability, using what you have without being defined by it, without performing it, without needing it witnessed, is part of why he was able to operate invisibly for so long. A Rick running a covert operation would leave fingerprints of genius on it. The need to be recognized as capable is hard to suppress. Evil Morty apparently didn't have that need, or suppressed it completely. Either way, the absence of that need is itself a form of capability. The sleep documentary format of this video is, in a strange way, appropriate for the subject. Evil Morty's story is best understood slowly, at a pace that allows the implications of each beat to settle before the next one arrives. The show presents presents his appearances in ways that reward unhurried attention. The Season 1 reveal is 30 seconds long, but if you watch it knowing everything that follows, those 30 seconds contain a complete character. You can't catch that in a fast watch. You have to slow down. The story doesn't rush to its conclusion. It takes 4 seasons to complete an arc that could have been compressed into 2, and the extension isn't padding, it's the method. The story is about patience, about long-term work toward an objective that requires staying invisible, about the capacity to wait without rushing. The arc's structure mirrors its subject. The telling is as patient as the telling is about, so it's appropriate to sit with it at a pace that lets all the pieces register, to let the Season 1 reveal sit before moving to Season 3, to let Season 3's election sit before moving to Season 5, to let the portal moment sit before moving to what comes after. There's something in this story, if you've been listening, that's easy to find but easy to miss. The possibility that understanding how a thing was built is the first step toward deciding what to do about it. Evil Morty understood how the curve was built. He understood what it was for and who it served and what it prevented. And that understanding, combined with the patience to accumulate the capability to act on it, produced the event that altered the cosmology of the show. Understanding doesn't always lead to action, but it's usually where action has to start. Whatever you make of what Evil Morty did, whatever your verdict on his methods, his ethics, the cost of what he accomplished, the understanding came first. He saw it clearly enough to know it could be broken, clearly enough to build the thing that would break it, and clearly enough, at the end, to walk through the opening without looking back. That's the story. Sleep well.